Who exactly do you think you're fooling? The sharp crack of Victoria Blackwell's palm against Elijah Morrison's cheek echoed through first class like a gunshot fired in a cathedral. 10-year-old Elijah didn't flinch, didn't cry. His deep brown eyes, startlingly composed, simply looked up at flight attendant Victoria Blackwell with the weight of 1,000 untold stories. His small hand reached slowly to his face, not in pain, but in documentation, as if mentally recording the exact dimensions of the red mark blooming across his dark skin, a crimson badge branded by prejudice. What Victoria didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, as her hand connected with the boy's face, was that she had just slapped the son of one of America's most powerful billionaires, triggering a chain reaction that would bring an entire airline to its knees and transform an industry forever. The cabin of Flight 527 from Chicago to New York fell into stunned silence. Passengers in first class froze mid-motion. A man with his coffee cup halfway to his lips, a woman's finger hovering over her tablet screen. A flight attendant paused in the galley doorway, hand covering her mouth. In that suspended moment before the chaos erupted, before the cameras started recording, before the lawsuits and hearings and headlines, there was just the echo of that slap and the unnatural composure of a child who should have been crying but wasn't. Elijah's gaze remained steady, his breathing controlled through techniques his mother, Dr. Imani Morrison, chief of neurosurgery at Mercy Hospital and founder of the Morrison Medical Justice Foundation, had taught him for moments exactly like this. His father, Dominic Morrison, CEO of Morrison Technologies and the third richest black man in America, had prepared him too, not with comfort, but with strategy. When they show you who they are, he told Elijah repeatedly, document everything. Your evidence speaks when your voice cannot. And so, as the red imprint of adult fingers brightened on his cheek, Elijah Morrison didn't break. He began to document. The morning sun had painted golden stripes across the tarmac at O'Hare International Airport. As Flight 527 prepared for its journey to New York, among the river of passengers flowing through the jet bridge, one figure stood out, not for what he did, but for what he didn't do. Elijah Morrison, all of 10 years old, moved through the crowd, with a composure that seemed borrowed from someone 3 times his age. His navy blazer was perfectly pressed school crest on the breast pocket, gleaming subtly in the overhead lights. His small carry-on rolled behind him with practiced precision, and his eyes, those deep brown eyes, held a stillness that made seasoned travelers do double takes. Elijah had learned early that the world watched him differently, not because of his father's billions or his mother's groundbreaking medical patents, but because of the color of his skin in spaces where people didn't expect to see him. He'd been taught by his grandmother, Dr. Grace Morrison, a woman who'd marched with King and later became one of the first black female judges in Illinois, that dignity was a shield no one could take from you unless you handed it over. They'll try to make you small, she told him, her hands steady on his shoulders like anchors in a storm. They'll try to make you angry. They'll try to make you forget who you are. But remember, your dignity isn't theirs to take. It was bought with the blood of your ancestors and paid for with the tears of your parents. Guard it like the treasure it is. Today, that lesson would be tested in ways no child should endure. As Elijah approached the aircraft door, his heart beating slightly faster than normal, despite his outward calm, he carefully retrieved his boarding pass from his jacket pocket. Seat 2A, first class. The flight attendant at the door, a younger woman named Lucia Rodriguez, smiled genuinely at him. Good morning, young man. Flying by yourself today? Her voice carried no judgment, just professional warmth. Yes, ma'am, Elijah replied, his voice quiet but clear. My mother is meeting me in New York. Lucia checked his boarding pass, noting the unaccompanied minor designation and the premium cabin assignment. Nothing unusual registered in her expression, just a professional welcome. Wonderful. Let me show you to your seat. But as they moved through the cabin, Victoria Blackwell, the lead flight attendant, working first class, noticed them approaching. Something in her chest tightened at the sight of the young black boy in casual clothes being escorted toward the premium cabin. Her shoulders squared almost imperceptibly, her smile calcifying into something that resembled hospitality, but carried none of its warmth. Victoria Blackwell had been a flight attendant for 15 years. She prided herself on knowing passengers, reading them like well-worn books from years of experience. The entitled businessmen, the nervous first-time flyers, the families barely holding it together. She could spot them all within seconds and adjust her service accordingly. But when she saw Elijah Morrison approaching first class, something in her expression shifted. Not fear exactly, but something older, something she'd inherited, without questioning, something that whispered, "He doesn't belong here." The same whisper that had followed her through her own working-class childhood, through the Flight Attendant Academy, where she'd ranked top of her class, through 15 years of serving the privileged, while never quite becoming one of them. "Lucia." She called, her voice carrying that particular brand of artificial sweetness that barely masked suspicion. "I'll take over from here." Lucia hesitated, her eyes darting between Victoria and Elijah. She'd seen this before, Victoria's special attention to passengers who didn't fit her mental image of first class. Usually she stayed silent, unwilling to challenge her superior. Today something made her pause. "He's all checked in, Victoria. Proper documentation and everything." The slight emphasis on proper was Lucia's small act of resistance. "I said I'll handle it." Victoria's tone hardened, just enough to make Lucia step back. "Of course." Lucia retreated to the boarding door, but her discomfort remained visible in the tension of her shoulders. Victoria turned to Elijah, who had paused at row 2, checking his boarding pass once more. "Excuse me, young man." Victoria's voice cut through the ambient cabin noise like a blade. Her tone carried the weight of authority hardened by years of service. "I think you might be confused. This is first class." Elijah looked up at her, his expression unchanging. "Yes, ma'am. Seat 2A." His voice was quiet, respectful, each word carefully measured. He'd been taught to speak this way in situations like these. Clear calm, giving no one an excuse to escalate. Inside, though, his stomach clenched. Not again, he thought. The third time this month. Victoria's perfectly painted lips pressed into a thin line, like a wound stitched shut, concealing the poison building behind them. She glanced around the cabin, noting the other first-class passengers. A software executive typing furiously on his laptop. An elderly black woman settling in with her newspaper. A young white woman in designer clothing scrolling through her phone. All of them belonged here in her mind. But this child, this black child, traveling alone in clothes that probably cost more than she made in a month. No, something was wrong. Something was out of place, and Victoria Blackwell had built her career on maintaining order. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass," she said, her hand already extended, fingers tapping impatiently against her palm like she was keeping time to music only she could hear. Elijah wordlessly handed over his documents, not just the boarding pass, but also a sealed envelope marked with the airline's Level Alpha clearance, a designation reserved for diplomats, federal judges, and the children of certain individuals whose safety and comfort the airline had contractual obligations to ensure. The seal bore the signature of the airline's chief security officer and included embedded security features that even most senior staff rarely encountered. It was a protocol most flight attendants never encountered in their entire careers. Victoria barely glanced at the envelope, dismissing its significance with practiced indifference. Her eyes were fixed on the boarding pass, searching for any excuse, any small discrepancy that would justify her growing discomfort. Finding none, she held the papers up to the light, as if checking for forgery, squinting at the holographic watermark that confirmed its authenticity. "Where are your parents?" she demanded, her voice growing harder, the sweetness evaporating like morning dew under a harsh sun. "My mother is meeting me in New York," Elijah replied evenly, maintaining eye contact, despite the discomfort it caused him. "My father is in Singapore on business. All the information is in that envelope, ma'am, including emergency contact numbers." The cabin was filling now. Other passengers were beginning to notice the interaction, the unusual scrutiny being applied to a child in row 3C. Michael Brooks, a former military officer turned private security consultant, lowered his newspaper slightly. His trained eyes took in the scene. The child's rigid posture, the flight attendant's aggressive stance, the way her hand gripped the documents like weapons. Michael had seen this before, not just on planes. He'd seen it in Baghdad when local allies were questioned by suspicious soldiers. He'd seen it in his own childhood neighborhood in Detroit when his black friends were stopped for being in the wrong parts of town. The dynamics of power and prejudice had a universal grammar, and he recognized every word of this exchange. "This is highly irregular," Victoria announced loudly enough for others to hear, as if seeking validation from the surrounding passengers. A child this young traveling alone in first class. "I don't think so." Mrs. Eleanor Jackson, seated in 4B, had lived through the Montgomery bus boycott. At 78, she carried the history of America's struggle for civil rights in the lines of her face and the steel of her spine. She recognized the scene unfolding before her with painful clarity. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, she activated the video function on her phone, resting it on her tray table at just the right angle. She'd learned long ago that bearing witness was sometimes the most powerful thing you could do. "Ma'am," Elijah said, his voice still steady, though his small hands had begun to tremble slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of maintaining composure. "Everything is in order. May I please take my seat?" It was the please that seemed to trigger something in Victoria. Perhaps it was too polite, too proper, for what she expected from a child she'd already decided didn't belong. Or perhaps it was the way other passengers were now openly watching, and she felt her authority being questioned, her judgment being scrutinized in real time. "Don't you talk back to me," she snapped, though Elijah had done nothing of the sort. "I know exactly what's happening here. Someone probably gave you this ticket, or you found it, or—" She paused, her imagination filling in increasingly absurd scenarios. "This has scam written all over it. I'm calling security." "Please do," Elijah said quietly, reaching for his phone, a gesture he'd been taught by his father. "I'll call my mother's security team as well." The movement was small, just a child reaching for a phone, but Victoria interpreted it as defiance, as a challenge to her authority, in front of a cabin full of witnesses. Her hand shot out, grabbing Elijah's wrist with enough force to make him wince. "You don't touch anything until I say so," she hissed, her voice low, but filled with venom. The cabin had gone silent now. Every passenger in first class and several from business class were watching, some with discomfort, some with outrage, some with a familiar weariness that came from seeing this scene play out in different forms throughout their lives. Michael Brooks had half risen from his seat, his instincts screaming at him to intervene. The child reminded him of his own nephew, same age, same composure beyond his years, same burden of having to navigate spaces not designed with him in mind. But Elijah caught his eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. The child had been trained for this, Michael realized with a mixture of admiration and deep sadness. Trained to endure, to document, to let the aggressor reveal themselves fully. Michael had been trained to first as a Marine then as security personnel. He knew when to move and when to observe. For now he would watch, but his hand drifted to his phone finger, hovering over the record button. Victoria. Another flight attendant, Lucia Rodriguez, approached, tentatively. The tension in the cabin was palpable, thick enough to cut with the plastic knives they served with meals. Maybe we should check the level alpha protocols. I've never seen that clearance before, but it looks official. I'm handling a security situation. Victoria cut her off, the sharpness in her tone making Lucia flinch. This isn't your section. Victoria's behavior triggered something in Lucia. Memories of her own mother being questioned in stores, of her brother being followed by security guards, of 1,000 small indignities, born with quiet dignity. For years, she'd stayed silent in moments like these, prioritizing peace over justice, her job over her conscience. But something in Elijah's composed face broke through her practiced neutrality. Victoria, he's just a child, Lucia said softly. Maybe we should. I said I'm handling it. Victoria's voice rose, drawing even more attention. She turned back to Elijah, still gripping his wrist, and that's when she saw it. A small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Not smugness, not defiance, but something else. Pity, perhaps, or worse, understanding. As if this child could see right through her, could see the fear and prejudice she dressed up as concern for security, could see the woman who'd been passed over for promotion 3 times, whose husband had left for a younger flight attendant, whose bills piled up while she served champagne to passengers who wouldn't remember her name. You think this is funny? Victoria's voice rose to a near shriek. The pressure she'd been containing, the frustration of her authority, being challenged by a child, the growing awareness that she was being watched and recorded. It all culminated in a moment of complete loss of control. Her free hand rose and came down hard across Elijah's face. The sound of the slap seemed to echo in the pressurized cabin, followed by a collective gasp from the passengers. Someone dropped a coffee cup, the liquid spreading across the aisle like a dark tide. Someone else stood up so fast, their tray table clattered against the seat in front of them. Elijah's head turned with the force of the blow, a red mark already blooming across his dark skin like a terrible flower. But he didn't cry. He didn't shout. In that frozen moment, as the shock rippled through the cabin, Elijah's mind went blank, then crystal clear. The sting on his cheek faded behind the wall of training his parents had built in him. Years of preparation for this exact scenario, not because they wanted him to face discrimination, but because they knew he would. He simply straightened his head, looked Victoria directly in the eye, and said in a voice that carried throughout the silent cabin, "My name is Elijah Dominic Morrison. My mother is Dr. Imani Morrison, Chief of Neurosurgery at Mercy Hospital and founder of the Morrison Medical Justice Foundation. My father is Dominic Morrison, CEO of Morrison Technologies. That envelope you're holding contains a letter from your airline's president personally guaranteeing my safety on this flight. You just assaulted a minor in front of 37 witnesses." Each word fell like a hammer on an anvil, shaping the moment into something that could never be undone. The cabin seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Victoria's hand released his wrist, as if it had turned to hot coal. The blood drained from her face as the implications of what she'd done began to sink in. But rage and pride wouldn't let her back down. Not yet. "You're lying," she said, though her voice had lost its conviction, cracking on the second word. She looked down at the envelope she'd been holding, really looked at it for the first time. The level alpha seal seemed to pulse with significance, the holographic emblem catching the light like a warning beacon. With shaking hands, she tore it open, her eyes scanning the letter inside. As she read, her face went from pale to gray, the color of concrete in rain. The letter was brief, but devastating in its clarity. It confirmed Elijah's identity, his clearance level, and included a direct phone number to the airline's executive offices should any issues arise. At the bottom in bold letters was a warning about the legal ramifications of failing to ensure the safety and comfort of Level Alpha passengers. It was signed by the airline's president himself. I didn't. Victoria stammered the letter, fluttering from her nerveless fingers like a wounded bird. Elijah bent down, picked up the letter with careful precision, and smoothed it against his blazer. Then he did something that would haunt Victoria for the rest of her life. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small notebook and pen, and began to write. "What are you doing?" Victoria asked, her voice now, small, frightened, barely recognizable as the same one that had been barking orders moments before. Documenting, Elijah replied without looking up. "My mother taught me to always document." His pen moved steadily across the page, the scratching sound audible in the hushed cabin. Time, 8:47 a.m. Witness count approximately 40. Physical contact lasted 12 seconds. Verbal harassment began at 8:43 a.m. He paused, then added, "Impact mark on left cheek, likely to bruise based on force applied. Photographs will be taken upon landing." The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. This wasn't how a 10-year-old was supposed to react to being slapped. There was something deeply unsettling about his composure, something that spoke to a reality where children had to be trained to handle adult cruelty with strategic precision. In the silence, Elijah's heart hammered against his ribcage, his palms damp with sweat. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind. "Never let them see your pain. They haven't earned it." But the effort of maintaining his composure was draining him. He wanted to cry. He wanted to run. He wanted to be just a boy, not a symbol, not a target, not a test case. Instead, he continued writing, his hand steady, despite the storm inside him. "Everyone, please take your seats." The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, unaware of the drama unfolding in first class. "We're preparing for departure." But Victoria wasn't done. Perhaps it was the humiliation, the growing realization that her career was over, or simply the need to justify what she'd done. She grabbed the notebook from Elijah's hands and tore it in half, then quarters, letting the pieces fall like snow around his feet. "You manipulative little—" she began, but was cut off by a firm hand on her shoulder. Michael Brooks had seen enough. The former Marine stood at his full 6'3" height, his presence immediately commanding. His own father had been denied a seat at a lunch counter in 1963. His brother had been stopped by police 17 times before his 30th birthday. His nephew had been followed through department stores since he was 8. The weight of history stood with him as he stepped into the aisle. "Ma'am, step away from the child now." His voice was quiet, but carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Who do you think you are?" Victoria started, her face flushing. "This is an airline matter." Michael had already pulled out his phone, revealing a screen that showed he'd been recording for the past several minutes. "I'm someone who recognizes assault when I see it. I'm someone who spent 12 years defending this country so that children wouldn't be terrorized for existing. And I'm someone who's about to send this video to every news outlet in the country if you say another word to that young man." His voice remained calm, but his eyes held a cold fire. "Step away." Victoria looked around the cabin, seeing phones held up like weapons of truth. Mrs. Eleanor Jackson's weathered hands steady as she continued recording. The young woman in designer clothing was live streaming softly, narrating the events to her thousands of followers. Even some of the business class passengers had stood up to capture the scene. "You don't understand." Victoria's protests died as Lucia gently but firmly guided her toward the galley. "Victoria, you need to step back now," Lucia whispered urgently. "This is serious. This is very, very serious." Elijah remained standing in the aisle, a small island of dignity in a sea of chaos. He reached for his phone again, this time successfully, and hit a single button, an emergency alert that would go directly to his mother's security team and legal counsel. The wristband he wore, disguised as a simple fitness tracker, had already been recording audio since the confrontation began. His father had insisted on the device after a similar, though less violent, incident the previous year at a hotel in Dallas. Trust is a luxury, Dominic had told him. Evidence is a necessity. Young man Mrs. Eleanor Jackson spoke up, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd lived through history. "Would you like to sit with me until we get this sorted out?" Elijah looked at her, and for the first time his composure cracked just slightly. His eyes, those old soul eyes, showed a flicker of the child he was supposed to be. A child who, despite everything, still wanted comfort in the face of cruelty. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice softer now, a hairline fracture appearing in his practiced calm. "But I'll take my assigned seat. I don't want to cause any more trouble." "Child, you haven't caused any trouble," Mrs. Jackson said firmly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You've just shown more grace under pressure than most adults could manage. And that grace doesn't make what happened to you right." As Elijah finally took his seat in 2A, the cabin erupted in hushed conversations. Flight attendants scrambled to manage the situation. The captain, finally informed of the incident, made the decision to return to the gate. What had started as a routine flight to New York was about to become national news. Elijah pulled out another small notebook from his bag. He always carried spares. Another lesson from his mother, and began writing again. This time he wasn't documenting the incident. He was writing a letter to his little sister Zoe, telling her about the clouds outside the window, about the interesting book he was reading about anything except what had just happened. He'd learned to compartmentalize early, to put trauma in boxes to be dealt with later in safer spaces. But his phone was buzzing now. The emergency alert had done its job. Within minutes, a team of lawyers would be mobilized. Within an hour, his mother would be in an emergency meeting with the airline's executives. Within a day, the world would know what had happened on Flight 527. The businessman who'd been typing on his laptop had stopped working entirely. He stared at Elijah with a mixture of awe and shame. Awe at the child's composure. Shame that he'd sat there for minutes watching it unfold without intervening. He thought of his own son, roughly Elijah's age, and imagined him in this situation. The rage that thought inspired finally moved him to action. "Excuse me," he called out to Lucia, who was trying to manage the increasingly agitated passengers. "I need to make a statement. I'm David Wilson, senior partner at Wilson & Associates. I witnessed the entire incident, and I'm willing to testify to what I saw." He pulled out a business card. "That child was assaulted. This is a crime scene." The word crime rippled through the cabin like electricity. This wasn't just bad customer service or a misunderstanding. This wasn't a customer complaint to be handled with vouchers and apologies. This was assault on a minor, documented from multiple angles with dozens of witnesses. Victoria, hidden in the galley, could hear the mounting chorus of support for Elijah. Each voice was another nail in the coffin of her career, possibly her freedom. She'd struck a child on camera, a black child with powerful parents, and the documentation to prove he belonged exactly where he was. Her mind raced, trying to find justification, excuses, someone else to blame. She'd been trained to maintain order, hadn't she? The boy was being disrespectful, wasn't he? She was just doing her job, protecting the airline's premium cabin from potential fraud. The explanation sounded hollow, even in her own mind. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice returned, notably more tense than before. "We're returning to the gate due to a security situation. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." But everyone knew the security situation wasn't Elijah. It was what would happen when news of this incident reached his mother. Dr. Dominic Morrison was brilliant, methodical, and absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting her children. She'd built a medical career and a fortune through strategic precision. Victoria Blackwell had no idea what she'd unleashed. As the plane taxied back, Elijah felt his phone buzz with a text from his mother. Security team en route. Legal filing prepared. You're safe. I love you. He typed back. I'm okay, Mom. I documented everything. His hands trembled slightly as he typed the first physical sign of the turmoil inside him. Her response was immediate. That's my brave boy. This ends today. Not just for you, but for every child who's ever been made to feel they don't belong. And Elijah knew she meant it. This wasn't just about one slap, one moment of prejudice. This was about every child who'd been made to feel they didn't belong, every young person who'd been judged by their skin color rather than their character. His mother had taught him that sometimes enduring injustice with dignity was the most powerful form of resistance. But today that dignity would be a weapon, not just a shield. The plane had barely reached the gate when uniformed officers appeared at the aircraft door. They weren't there to arrest anyone yet. They were there to secure the scene, take statements, and ensure Elijah's safety. The airline's head of security at O'Hare was personally overseeing the situation, having received what he later described as the most terrifying phone call of my career from the airline's CEO. Mr. Morrison, I'm Officer Ramirez. One of the security personnel said, kneeling to Elijah's eye level. We understand there was an incident. Are you okay? I'm okay. Elijah nodded. I'd like to make a formal statement and have photographs taken of the impact area for evidence purposes. Officer Ramirez blinked, taken aback by the child's composed request. Of course. We'll arrange that right away. As passengers were asked to remain seated for questioning, Elijah stood up calmly and walked toward the officers. Victoria watched from the galley as this child she'd dismissed, diminished, and assaulted moved with the confidence of someone who knew justice was coming. He paused at her hiding spot, looking at her with those impossibly composed eyes. Ms. Blackwell, he said quietly, my grandmother once told me that hatred is learned, which means it can be unlearned. I hope someday you figure out what made you so afraid of a child just trying to get home. Victoria couldn't respond. There were no words for the magnitude of her mistake, no explanation that could undo what she'd done. She'd let fear and prejudice guide her hand, and now that hand had destroyed everything she'd worked for. Inside her mind was chaotic. 15 years of service, mortgage payments due next week, her children's tuition, her reputation, all of it crumbling because of one moment of lost control. How had it happened so quickly? When had she become someone who would strike a child as Elijah was escorted off the plane by security for his protection? Not punishment. Every passenger in first class stood up, then business class, then economy. It wasn't coordinated or planned. It was spontaneous respect for a child who'd shown them all what dignity looked like. Mrs. Eleanor Jackson was crying openly now, remembering her own struggles, her own moments of having to maintain composure in the face of hatred. She thought of all the children who'd endured what Elijah had endured, but without the protection of wealth and documentation, without the phones recording their truth. I marched with Dr. King, she said to the passenger next to her, her voice thick with emotion. I sat at counters where they wouldn't serve me. I thought my grandchildren would live in a different world. But here we are, still watching our babies being treated like they're born suspicious. Michael Brooks saved his video to multiple cloud services, then called his contacts in the media. He'd seen combat, seen the worst of humanity, but watching a child handle brutality with such grace had shaken him. This story needed to be told. I need to speak with your assignment editor, he said into his phone, stepping into the jet bridge. I have footage of an airline assault on a minor that you're going to want to see. Yes, I'll hold. The young woman who'd been live streaming watched her viewer count climb past 100,000. The comments were pouring in outraged support demands for justice. She kept the stream going, narrating as Elijah was led away. "This is Elijah Morrison, 10 years old, who just showed us all what courage looks like. Remember his name." Within the hour, #justice for Elijah would be trending globally. The video clips would be dissected on every news channel. Victoria Blackwell would become the face of everything wrong with prejudice disguised as protocol. But more importantly, Elijah's composed response would inspire conversations in homes, schools, and boardrooms about dignity, discrimination, and the strength it takes to maintain your humanity when others lose theirs. The airline executives were in crisis mode before Flight 527 could be rerouted. They knew what was coming: the lawsuits, the boycotts, the complete destruction of their reputation. All because one flight attendant couldn't see past her prejudice to recognize a child's humanity. But Elijah wasn't thinking about any of that. As he sat in the airline's private lounge, security guards stationed outside his mother's voice on speakerphone. As she coordinated the response, he was thinking about his notebook torn to pieces on the first-class floor. Those had been notes for a school project about aviation history, about how humans had learned to fly. He'd have to start over, but that was okay. He'd learned something more important today. Sometimes standing your ground was its own form of flight. "Elijah." His mother's voice was soft now, just for him. "I'm proud of you. Grandma would be proud too." "I didn't cry, Mom," he said. And for the first time his voice wavered slightly. "I know, baby. You can cry now if you need to. You're safe." Finally alone, with just his mother's voice on the phone, Elijah let the tears come. Not loud, not dramatic, just silent streams running down his face, washing away the tension he'd been holding since Victoria first questioned his presence. "It's not fair, Mom," he whispered. "I was just trying to go see Grandma. I wasn't doing anything wrong." "I know, baby. I know." Imani's voice was gentle, but steel ran beneath it. "You did nothing wrong, and the world will know it." After composing himself, Elijah pulled out his spare notebook and began writing again. This time, he was documenting not just what had happened, but how it felt, the weight of being 10 years old and having to be perfect, the exhaustion of representing more than just yourself, the strange power that came from maintaining dignity when someone tried to strip it away. He wrote about Victoria Blackwell too, not with hatred, but with something approaching pity. What must it be like, he wondered, to be so afraid of a child that you would risk everything to put them in their place? What kind of pain or fear led to that moment when her hand met his face? Outside the lounge, the airport was buzzing with the story. Passengers who'd been on nearby flights were sharing what they'd heard. Airport employees were whispering about the flight attendant who'd been escorted away, about the child in the lounge, with a security detail about the executives flying in from headquarters to manage the crisis. But inside the lounge, Elijah Morrison was just a 10-year-old boy, writing in his notebook, waiting to go home. The revolution he'd started with his silence was already spreading beyond the airport, beyond Chicago, beyond anything Victoria Blackwell could have imagined when she first questioned his right to sit in 2A. The foundation of an entire airline's culture was about to crack. Policies would be rewritten, training programs overhauled. Victoria Blackwell would lose more than her job. She'd become a cautionary tale told in every customer service training session for decades to come. And Elijah would board another flight to New York later that day, this time with the airline's president, personally ensuring his comfort. He would take his seat still 2A. He insisted on that, and pull out his notebook. He would write about clouds and books, and anything but the morning's events, because he was still, despite everything, just a child trying to get home. But the image of him standing in that aisle, composed and dignified, while an adult fell apart around him, would become something more than just viral content. It would become a mirror, held up to society, forcing people to see what they'd become and what they could be instead. The slap had lasted less than a second. The impact would last forever. The private lounge where Elijah waited was a study in contrasts. Luxurious leather chairs and worried executives, pristine marble floors, and the chaos of crisis management unfolding in real time. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see planes taking off and landing, carrying thousands of stories, though none quite like his. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing for the past hour, messages from classmates who'd seen the live stream, from relatives, offering support from numbers he didn't recognize, offering everything from legal advice to interview requests. Alone for a moment, Elijah's careful composure slipped again. His hands shook as he set down his phone. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a hollow feeling in his chest. He went to the private bathroom and stared at his reflection, the angry red mark on his cheek, now darkening toward purple. For a moment, he was just a scared kid far from home, hurting from an adult's cruelty. "You're okay," he whispered to himself, practicing the mantra his father had taught him. "You did everything right. You are not what they see. You are what you know yourself to be." By the time he returned to the main lounge area, his mask of composure was back in place. But inside, the trembling continued. Dr. Imani Morrison was already in the air, having commandeered a private jet from a colleague the moment she'd received the emergency alert. She'd performed surgery that morning, saving a 4-year-old's life, her hands steady as always. But when she'd seen the video of Victoria's hand striking her son's face, those same steady hands had trembled with a rage so pure it frightened even her. "I want everything," she told the legal team assembled via conference call in the jet's cabin. Flight records, training materials, previous complaints, employee evaluations. "I want to know if this woman has ever been disciplined, promoted, or reprimanded. I want to know who trained her, who supervised her, and who created the culture that made her think this was acceptable." Dominic Morrison reached in Singapore. Despite the time difference, had been quieter, but no less furious. "End them" was all he'd said to their legal team. "Complete structural change or we end them." His colleagues at the tech conference had been startled by the transformation. One moment, the charismatic CEO delivering a keynote on artificial intelligence ethics. The next, a father so coldly focused on vengeance that the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Not the flight attendant," he clarified later, speaking privately to his head of legal affairs. "She's a symptom. I want the disease, the whole system that hired her, trained her, and gave her power over my son." The whispers spreading through O'Hare were like wildfire in drought season. Every airline employee who heard the story felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. Victoria Blackwell wasn't just any flight attendant. She was a trainer, someone who'd shaped the attitudes and approaches of dozens of newer employees. If she could do this, what did that say about the culture she'd been fostering? Lucia Rodriguez, the younger flight attendant who tried to intervene, was sitting in a break room, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, replaying the scene in her mind. She'd worked under Victoria for 3 years, had noticed the small things, the way Victoria's smile never quite reached her eyes when serving certain passengers, the subtle changes in her tone, the almost imperceptible stiffening of her spine when a passenger of color sat in first class. Lucia had noticed, but had said nothing, done nothing, until it was almost too late. The weight of her silence felt heavier than her entire life. "I should have stopped her sooner," Lucia whispered to another colleague, Maria, who'd just heard about the incident. "The moment she questioned his ticket, I knew where it was heading. I've seen her do it before, just never this bad." Maria's eyes widened. Before. There were other incidents. Lucia nodded miserably. Nothing physical, but the questioning, the suspicion, the tone, always with certain passengers. Young black men in business class, Latino families in first class, anyone she didn't think looked like they belonged. We all saw it. We all stayed quiet. The memory of her own brother being questioned at a university library, asked to prove he was a student, while white students walked freely past, flashed in Lucia's mind. She'd failed him then too, minimizing his experience, suggesting he was overreacting. The pattern of silence felt suddenly unbearable. "I can't do this anymore," Lucia said, standing up suddenly. "I need to make a statement. If they fire me, they fire me." Their conversation was interrupted by James Marshall, the airline's head of O'Hare operations, bursting through the door with his phone pressed to his ear. His usually composed face was ash gray, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Yes, sir. I understand. Yes, the child is safe. No, sir. Ms. Blackwell is isolated pending. Yes, sir. Immediately." He ended the call and looked at the two flight attendants. That was the CEO. "He's flying in personally. The board is holding an emergency meeting. 20 years I've worked here and I've never seen anything like this." He paused, his voice dropping. "They're saying the Morrison family's lawyers have already filed not just a lawsuit. They're pushing for a federal investigation into widespread discrimination. Every complaint from the last decade is being reviewed." "Every complaint?" Maria asked, her face paling. "There must be hundreds. Thousands," Marshall corrected grimly. "And from what I'm hearing, they're going to find patterns no one can explain away." Meanwhile, Michael Brooks remained on the grounded plane, which had become an impromptu witness-gathering site. The FBI had arrived, and someone had made the argument that assaulting a child on an aircraft fell under federal jurisdiction. Passengers were being interviewed one by one, their stories painting a consistent picture of unprovoked aggression against a child whose only crime was existing in a space where he was legally entitled to be. "I've seen combat zones with less tension than that cabin," Michael told the federal agent taking his statement. "That child showed more discipline than soldiers I've trained." He was prepared for this, which is the saddest part. What kind of world do we live in, where a 10-year-old has to be trained to handle assault with strategic composure? The agent, a middle-aged black woman named Detective Sophia Washington, paused in her note-taking. She'd been on the force for 15 years, had seen the worst of humanity, but something about this case hit differently. Maybe it was the age of the victim, or maybe it was the calculated cruelty of the perpetrator. Or perhaps it was the fact that her own son was about Elijah's age and traveled frequently for chess tournaments. "Mr. Brooks," she said carefully, "you mentioned the child seemed trained for this. Can you elaborate?" Michael nodded, pulling up the video on his phone. "Watch his body language. See how he positions himself, always keeping his hands visible, non-threatening, speaking clearly, but not aggressively. He even angles his body so that multiple witnesses can see any physical contact. That's not natural behavior for a scared child that's training." He scrolled through the video, stopping at a specific moment. "Look at his eyes here right after she hits him. There's fear there, real fear, but he pushes it down immediately. Someone taught him to do that, to absorb the blow and keep functioning. I've only seen that kind of training in Special Forces operators and in kids who've had to grow up way too fast." Detective Washington watched the video, her jaw tightening as Victoria's hand made contact with Elijah's face. "Jesus Christ," she muttered, professionalism momentarily forgotten. "She really just slapped a baby, and he took it like he's been taking it his whole life." Her partner, a white officer named Detective Miller, leaned in to watch. "Kid's got nerves of steel, like he's done this before." "That's the point," Washington said, her voice hard. "No child should have to develop nerves of steel just to fly to visit their grandmother." Back in the private lounge, Elijah had been joined by Nathan Reynolds, the airline's chief legal counsel, who'd been rushed in from downtown Chicago. The man was sweating through his expensive suit, trying to maintain composure, while essentially begging a 10-year-old for mercy. Elijah Reynolds said, his voice strained, "I want you to know that the airline takes this very seriously. Ms. Blackwell's actions don't represent our values." "Mr. Reynolds." Elijah interrupted quietly, his notebook open on his lap. "I've been flying with your airline since I was 5. This is the 4th time I've been questioned about my seat. The 3rd time I've had my documents examined like they were forgeries. The 1st time I've been physically assaulted, but not the 1st time I've been made to feel like I don't belong." Reynolds's face went even paler, if that was possible. 4th time. There were other incidents. Elijah flipped back through his notebook, not the one Victoria had destroyed, but another one older, worn at the edges. September 15th, 2022. Flight 892 to Los Angeles. Flight attendant Rebecca Mills asked 3 times to see my boarding pass and called the gate agent to verify my mother had actually purchased a first-class ticket. He turned a page. December 3rd, 2022. Flight 334 to Boston. Flight attendant Carl Patterson insisted I must be lost and tried to escort me to economy despite my protests. Another page. June 18th, 2023. Flight 721 to Miami. Flight attendant Dorothy Turner demanded to speak to my parents before allowing me to board, causing a 15-minute delay. Each date, each flight number, each name was like a nail in the airline's coffin. Reynolds realized with growing horror that this child had been building a case for years, documenting each instance with the precision of a trained investigator. "You reported none of these?" Reynolds asked weakly. "My mother reported all of them," Elijah replied. "Your customer service department sent form letters each time apologizing for any inconvenience and offering flight vouchers. We have copies of everything." He flipped his notebook around, showing Reynolds photocopies of the form letters, each one nearly identical, despite the different incidents, each one dismissing a child's humiliation as a minor inconvenience. "This isn't about Ms. Blackwell," Elijah said, his voice suddenly sounding older than his years. "This is about a pattern. This is about your airline deciding that some people deserve dignity and others don't. My father says systems don't fail. They produce exactly what they're designed to produce." Reynolds had no response. The carefully prepared talking points about isolated incidents and one bad employee crumbled in the face of documented evidence spanning years. The sound of helicopters suddenly filled the air outside, news choppers circling O'Hare like mechanical vultures, sensing the magnitude of the story unfolding below. Justice. For Elijah had already surpassed 1 million mentions on social media. The video had been shared by celebrities, politicians, and civil rights leaders. Even the president's press secretary had been asked about it during an afternoon briefing. In the executive boardroom at airline headquarters, the emergency meeting was turning ugly. Board members were pointing fingers, trying to distance themselves from what was clearly becoming a corporate catastrophe. "We need to fire her immediately," one board member insisted. "Make a strong statement condemning her actions. Offer the family a significant settlement." "That won't be enough," said Richard Patterson, the CEO, who had been watching the video on repeat each viewing, deepening the lines on his face. "This isn't going away with a firing and a check. Look at this footage. Listen to what the boys said about previous incidents. This is a pattern, and we're all responsible." "That's hyperbole," another board member scoffed. "One employee lost control. Regrettable, but hardly a corporate conspiracy." Patterson pulled up an email on his tablet and slid it across the table. Complaint statistics by passenger demographics from last year's internal audit. We flagged black passengers for verification at 7 times the rate of white passengers. We've known this for months and done nothing. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria Blackwell sat in a small security office, watching her life unravel on the mounted TV screen. Every major network was covering the story, her face captured in the moment of striking Elijah. The still image made her look monstrous, her face contorted with rage, while Elijah remained serene. She didn't recognize herself, or perhaps she was finally seeing herself clearly for the first time. Her phone confiscated but visible on the desk, lit up continuously with calls and messages she couldn't answer. Her husband, her children, her mother, all trying to reach her to understand how the woman they knew could do such a thing. But Victoria didn't have answers for them. She barely had answers for herself. "I'm not racist," she whispered to the empty room. "I have black friends. My children's godmother is black." The words sounded hollow even to her own ears. If she wasn't racist, why had she questioned this child? Why had she assumed fraud? Why had she struck him? The door opened and Detective Washington entered, followed by another federal agent. "Ms. Blackwell, you're being charged with assault of a minor federal aviation violations and violation of civil rights. You have the right to remain silent." As they read her rights, Victoria felt a strange detachment, as if watching someone else's life implode. She thought about that morning, how she'd kissed her own children goodbye, straightened her uniform with pride, and headed to work, believing she was one of the good ones. How many times had she told herself she wasn't prejudiced, that she treated all passengers equally? The lies we tell ourselves, she thought, are the most dangerous ones. Dr. Imani Morrison's plane touched down at O'Hare, just as the sun was beginning its descent. She moved through the airport like a force of nature, her team of lawyers flanking her, her presence commanding without raising her voice. Airport security cleared a path. Employees whispered and stared, some taking photos despite themselves. This was not a grieving mother. This was a warrior preparing for battle. When she entered the lounge where Elijah waited, her professional composure finally cracked. She dropped to her knees and pulled her son into an embrace that seemed to last forever. Elijah, who'd remained stoic throughout the ordeal, finally let his shoulders shake with quiet sobs against his mother's shoulder. "I'm here, baby," she whispered, her voice fierce with love and protection. "I'm here, and this will never happen again. Not to you, not to any child, not on my watch." They stayed like that, mother and child, drawing strength from each other until Elijah's breathing steadied. He pulled back slightly, his eyes red but dry. "I did everything like you taught me," he said. "I documented everything. I kept calm. I didn't let them see me scared." "You did perfectly," Imani assured him, brushing her hand gently over his cheek, noting the bruise forming with clinical detachment, even as maternal rage burned in her chest. "But you should never have had to." When she finally released him and stood, the transformation was immediate. The mother receded, and the surgeon, the CEO, the force of nature returned. She turned to Reynolds, who actually took a step back from the intensity of her gaze. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded hurricanes, "I'm going to speak, and you're going to listen. Your airline assaulted my child not just today but repeatedly over years. We documented everything, hoping you would change, hoping training would improve, hoping my son wouldn't have to face what I faced, what his grandmother faced. But hope without action is just denial." Reynolds started to speak, but Imani held up a hand, silencing him. "I'm not interested in your apologies or your promises. I want structural change. I want every employee retrained with a focus on unconscious bias and de-escalation. I want a review of every complaint filed by passengers of color in the last decade. I want Victoria Blackwell prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and I want a public acknowledgement that this is not an isolated incident, but a pattern of discrimination that ends now. Dr. Morrison Reynolds said carefully, "What you're asking for would fundamentally restructure our entire training program, cost millions. Your market cap dropped by 300 million in the last 2 hours." Imani interrupted, glancing at her phone. "Major corporations are already pulling their contracts. 3 celebrity boycotts have been announced, with more coming. So yes, Mr. Reynolds, this will cost millions. The question is whether it costs millions or billions, and whether your company exists this time next year." Her cold precision was more terrifying than any shouting could have been. This wasn't emotional hyperbole. This was a surgeon's calculated incision, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "We want to make this right," Reynolds said, his voice steadier now that they were discussing concrete terms rather than moral abstractions. "No, Mr. Reynolds, you want this to go away," Imani corrected. "Making it right requires facing ugly truths about your company culture. It requires acknowledging that what happened to my son wasn't an aberration, but a manifestation of policies both written and unwritten. Are you prepared to do that?" Reynolds hesitated, caught between his instinct as a lawyer to admit nothing and his growing realization that standard corporate crisis management would not be sufficient here. I need to consult with the board," he finally said. "You do that." Imani nodded. "In the meantime, we'll be making our own statement. And unlike yours, it won't be crafted by a PR team trying to minimize damage. It will be the truth, backed by a decade of documentation." Outside the lounge, the crowd of reporters had grown exponentially. Someone had leaked that Dr. Morrison was in the building, and every news outlet wanted the exclusive. But Imani wasn't ready to speak publicly, not yet. She needed to ensure Elijah was truly okay, needed to coordinate with their legal team, needed to make sure that when she spoke, her words would create the change that violence against her son demanded. Mrs. Eleanor Jackson had finally been released from the plane and was immediately surrounded by reporters. The elderly woman, who'd spent most of her life avoiding attention, found herself the center of a media storm. "Mrs. Jackson, you were one of the first to record the incident. What made you pull out your phone?" Eleanor looked directly into the cameras, her weathered face set with determination. "I've lived through times when our word meant nothing against theirs. When a black child's pain was dismissed, disbelieved, or justified. I recorded because that young man deserved to have his truth documented. Because in 2025, we have the tools to prove what we've always known, that this happens, that it's real, and that it's wrong." "Do you think Ms. Blackwell should face jail time?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I think Ms. Blackwell should face justice. But more than that, I think every person who's ever looked at a black child and seen a threat instead of a child should face themselves in the mirror. This isn't just about one woman or one airline. This is about who we are as a society and who we want to be." Her words, broadcast live across the nation, seemed to shift something in the conversation. This wasn't just about Elijah Morrison anymore. It was about every child who'd been made to feel less than every young person who'd had to develop armor instead of innocence. In the security office, Victoria Blackwell was being processed for transport to federal detention. As they fingerprinted her, she thought about her own children, who were mixed race, navigating a world she'd just made harder for them. What would she tell them? How would she explain that their mother, who'd taught them to treat everyone with kindness, had struck a child for the crime of existing in a space she didn't think he deserved? Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of her husband, Daniel Blackwell, his face drawn with worry, and something else, disappointment perhaps, or a deeper disillusionment. "Victoria," he said, his voice barely audible. "What happened? What did you do?" "I don't know," she answered honestly. He was so calm, so confident. It made me angry. I can't explain it." Daniel shook his head, struggling to reconcile the woman he loved with the person he'd seen on video. Our kids have seen it, Victoria. It's everywhere. Marcus asked me, if you hate black kids, if you hate him. The weight of those words crushed something in Victoria's chest. Their son, their beautiful 12-year-old son, thinking his mother might hate him because of his skin color. No, she whispered. God, no. I love him. I love both our children more than anything. Then why? Daniel pressed. Why would you do this to someone else's child? Victoria had no answer. The contradiction was too stark, too painful to face. How she could love her own biracial children while harboring such prejudice against a black child she didn't know. The transport vehicle pulled away from O'Hare, just as Elijah and his mother were preparing to leave for their hotel. They'd take a different flight tomorrow, or perhaps drive. The journey to New York no longer seemed urgent compared to the journey toward justice they'd begun. In the first-class cabin of Flight 527, still grounded on the tarmac, maintenance crews were cleaning up the torn pieces of Elijah's notebook. One worker, a young man named Miguel Santos, who'd heard about the incident, carefully collected each piece instead of vacuuming them up. He didn't know why exactly, but throwing away the destroyed words of a child who'd been assaulted felt wrong. He placed the pieces in an envelope and made a note to try to return them to the family. As news of the incident continued to spread, other stories began emerging. Flight attendants from various airlines reached out to journalists with their own accounts of witnessing or experiencing discrimination. Parents shared stories of their children being questioned, harassed, or humiliated while flying. What had started as one incident was revealing itself to be part of a much larger pattern. The airline's stock continued to plummet in after-hours trading. Board members who'd been enjoying their evening were pulled into emergency video conferences. The PR department worked frantically to draft statements that seemed increasingly inadequate against the tide of public outrage. How do you apologize for something that reveals a rot at the core of your corporate culture? We can't just say, this doesn't represent our values, when all evidence suggests it absolutely does represent our values, argued Gabriela Hernandez, the airline's new head of diversity and inclusion, a position that had been largely ceremonial until today. We need to acknowledge the truth before we can change it. Admitting liability would be corporate suicide, countered another executive. The legal exposure alone. We're already exposed, Gabriela interrupted, slamming her hand on the table. The evidence is there for anyone to see. The question is whether we own it and fix it or deny it, and die a slow, humiliating death by 1,000 lawsuits. By nightfall, vigils were being organized at major airports across the country. Parents brought their children holding signs that read, "Every child deserves dignity, and we are all Elijah Morrison." The movement that had begun with a slap was becoming something larger, a reckoning with how America treats its black children, how prejudice operates in spaces of privilege, and how one child's composure in the face of cruelty could inspire a nation to confront its own biases. Elijah finally settled in a hotel suite, with his mother was reading the comments on various news articles. Not all of them. His mother monitored carefully, but enough to understand the impact of what had happened. Some comments defended Victoria, making excuses, claiming he must have done something to provoke her. But far more expressed outrage, shared their own stories, and praised his courage. "Mom," he said quietly, looking up from his tablet. "Why did she hate me so much? She didn't even know me." Imani sat beside her son, choosing her words carefully. "She didn't hate you, baby. She feared what you represented, a young black man, comfortable in spaces she believed belonged only to people who looked like her. That fear turned to anger, and anger made her cruel." "But I'm just a kid," Elijah said, and for the first time he sounded like one. "I know, sweetheart. And that's what makes this so wrong. You should be allowed to just be a kid, to travel without having to prove you belong, to exist without having to be perfect. She pulled him close. But until the world gets better, we have to be better than we should have to be. And today, you were extraordinary. As they sat together watching the Chicago skyline light up against the darkness, Elijah thought about the notebook Victoria had destroyed. He'd been writing about how humans learned to fly, about the Wright brothers and their determination to achieve the impossible. Maybe he thought this was another kind of flight, the slow, difficult ascent toward a world where children could be children, regardless of their skin color. His phone buzzed with a text from his father in Singapore. "Watch the video. Proud of you, son. Flying home tonight. The world is about to change and you started it." But Elijah didn't feel like he'd started anything. He'd simply refused to accept what had always been unacceptable. He'd stood his ground when someone tried to make him small. He'd documented injustice instead of being destroyed by it. If that was revolutionary, what did that say about the world they lived in? The hotel's conference room had been converted into a media center with dozens of cameras, hundreds of journalists, and a live stream that would be watched by millions. When the Morrison family entered the room, fell silent. Imani spoke first, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who'd saved countless lives and was now fighting to save something larger, the dignity of children everywhere. She outlined their demands, not just from the airline, but from the industry as a whole: federal oversight, mandatory reporting of discrimination incidents, and real consequences for perpetrators. Then, unexpectedly, Elijah stepped up to the microphone, which had to be lowered for his height. The clicking of cameras was deafening for a moment. Then silence fell again. "My name is Elijah Morrison," he began, his voice soft but clear. "I'm 10 years old. I like reading, playing soccer, and building robots with my dad. I'm just a kid who wanted to visit my grandmother. But because of the color of my skin, I was treated like a threat instead of a child." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, many with tears in their eyes. "Ms. Blackwell hit me because she was afraid of who I might become. But I already know who I am. I am the great-great-grandson of enslaved people who survived the unsurvivable. I am the grandson of civil rights workers who changed America with their courage. I am the son of parents who taught me that dignity is my birthright no matter who tries to take it away." His voice grew stronger. "What happened to me happens to kids every day in different ways. They just don't usually have cameras recording it. They don't have lawyers to fight for them. They don't have parents with resources to demand justice. So we're not just fighting for me. We're fighting for every child who's been made to feel like they don't belong." He held up his notebook, a new one, but carried with the same purpose. "I'm going to keep documenting not just the bad things, but the good ones too. Like the passengers who stood up for me. Like Mr. Brooks, who intervened. Like Mrs. Jackson, who made sure there was evidence. Like all of you who are demanding better. That's the world I want to write about, one where adults protect children instead of hurting them." When he stepped back from the microphone, the room erupted in applause. Hardened journalists were crying. Even the camera operators were wiping their eyes. This 10-year-old had just articulated what many adults struggled to express: the exhaustion of having to be perfect, the weight of representation, and the hope that things could change. The first question came from a major network anchor, Elijah. "What would you say to Victoria Blackwell if she were here?" Elijah thought carefully, his parents ready to intervene if needed. But he answered on his own. "I would tell her that I forgive her not because what she did was okay, but because holding on to anger would make me like her. I would tell her that it's never too late to learn to grow, to become better. And I would ask her to use what happened to help other people unlearn their prejudice. That would be justice, not just punishment, but transformation." The press conference continued for another hour, with the Morrisons outlining their legal strategy, their foundation's initiatives, and their vision for structural change. But it was Elijah's words that would be replayed, endlessly shared millions of times, and quoted in boardrooms and classrooms across the country. After the cameras stopped rolling, after the last journalist left, Elijah slipped into the hotel's restroom. There, alone in a stall, he finally broke down completely, shoulders heaving with silent sobs, the weight of the day crushing down on him. He cried for the unfairness, for the pain, for the child he sometimes wasn't allowed to be. He cried until the tears wouldn't come anymore, and then he splashed cold water on his face, straightened his tie, and walked back out to face the world again with that same composed expression. Because that's what he'd been taught to do, to feel his feelings in private and show only strength in public. The cost of that lesson was one he'd reckon with for years to come. That evening, as the Morrisons finally had dinner together in private, the machinery of change was grinding forward. The federal investigation had officially begun. Other airlines were preemptively announcing their own bias training programs. Flight attendant unions were grappling with how to support their members while acknowledging the need for reform. In a television studio across town, Mrs. Eleanor Jackson was being interviewed on morning television. The elderly woman who'd wanted nothing more than a quiet flight to visit her grandchildren had become an unexpected voice for justice. "People keep calling Elijah brave," she told the interviewer. And he was. But no child should have to be that brave just to exist in public spaces. When I was young, we fought so that our children wouldn't have to face what we faced. Yet here we are in 2025, and a 10-year-old boy still needs to document discrimination, like he's gathering evidence for a court case because he has to be. What would you say to Victoria Blackwell if she were watching, the interviewer asked. Eleanor looked directly into the camera. "I'd tell her that hatred is a poison you drink hoping others will die. But it only destroys you from the inside. I hope she gets help. I hope she learns. But mostly, I hope she never has power over another child again." Meanwhile, in the airline's emergency boardroom, 12 executives had been locked in heated debate since 3:00 a.m. The mahogany table that usually hosted quarterly reports and profit projections was now covered with legal documents, tablets showing plummeting stock prices, and phones that wouldn't stop ringing. CEO Richard Patterson, a man who'd built his career on steady growth and careful management, looked like he'd aged 5 years overnight. "We're hemorrhaging," CFO Margaret Lewis announced, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "Advanced bookings are down 40%. Corporate accounts representing $200 million in annual revenue have suspended their contracts pending our response. The flight attendants union is threatening action if we don't support Victoria, while civil rights groups are demanding her immediate termination and prosecution. We need to stand by our employee," argued Senior Vice President of Operations William Hargrove. "She's worked for us for 15 years. One mistake shouldn't end her career." "A mistake," Gabriela Hernandez interrupted incredulously. "Serving the wrong drink is a mistake. Slapping a child is assault. We don't know what that kid did to provoke," William began. "Stop right there," Richard Patterson cut in, his voice sharp. "I've watched that video 30 times. That child did nothing to provoke being assaulted. Nothing. And the fact that your instinct is to blame a 10-year-old tells me exactly why we're in this mess." The room fell uncomfortably silent. "Here's what we know," Patterson continued, pulling up a presentation on the screen. "Victoria Blackwell has been the subject of 17 passenger complaints in the last 5 years, 12 of them from passengers of color. None resulted in disciplinary action. She's also been a training leader for new flight attendants, specifically teaching them how to identify suspicious passengers." He clicked to the next slide, showing a training video screenshot with Victoria speaking to a class of new hires. This slide from her presentation shows examples of passengers to verify more carefully. Notice anything about them. The images showed mostly people of color, with notes about casual dress in premium cabins and excessive documentation as red flags. "My God," whispered one board member. "We've been training them to profile." "Exactly." Patterson nodded grimly. "Victoria Blackwell didn't create this problem. We did. We created a culture where discrimination was not just allowed but encouraged under the guise of security and verification. And now we're going to pay for it." "So what do we do?" Margaret asked. "Fire her and hope it goes away." Patterson rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of 40 years in aviation pressing down on him. "How did we get here? How did one flight attendant destroy everything we've built?" "She didn't," Gabriella said, her voice quiet but firm. "Victoria Blackwell didn't destroy anything. She revealed what was already broken. We've had 347 complaints about discriminatory treatment in the past 5 years. We've settled 23 lawsuits quietly. We've transferred problem employees instead of addressing their behavior. Victoria Blackwell isn't an anomaly. She's a symptom." The room fell silent. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the first flights of the day were taking off. Each plane carried hundreds of passengers who were now questioning whether they wanted to fly with an airline that would assault a child. "What do we do?" Margaret repeated. "We have 2 choices," Patterson said slowly. "We can treat this as a PR crisis to be managed, throw Victoria under the bus, make some token changes, and hope it all blows over. Or we can use this as a catalyst for real change. The first option is cheaper," William pointed out. "The first option will kill this airline," Patterson countered. "The Morrisons aren't going away. This isn't a family looking for a quick settlement. They're looking for justice, and they have the resources and the determination to get it. Our only path forward is to acknowledge the problem and commit to fixing it completely and transparently." "That could cost hundreds of millions," Margaret warned. "Our market cap has already dropped by billions," Patterson pointed out. "This isn't about money anymore. It's about survival." Victoria Blackwell's world had collapsed into the dimensions of a federal holding cell. The orange jumpsuit felt alien against her skin, the fabric rough and unfamiliar compared to the crisp uniform she'd worn with such pride for 15 years. Her lawyer, a public defender named James Powell, who'd drawn the short straw for what was becoming the most hated case in America, sat across from her with a legal pad. "Victoria," he said wearily, "we need to discuss your options. The video evidence is incontrovertible. You struck a child on a federal aircraft. The FBI is involved. The Department of Justice is considering hate crime enhancements. Your best option is to plead guilty and hope for leniency." Victoria's hands were shaking. Without her uniform, without the authority it represented, she looked smaller, older, more fragile. "I didn't mean to hit him. He was so calm, so sure of himself. It made me angry." Why, James asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, then whispered, "Because he belonged there more than I ever would. I've worked for 15 years to afford a vacation in first class. He was wearing a watch worth more than my car, a 10-year-old with more confidence and composure than I've ever had. It wasn't fair." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest, in a way Victoria had never allowed herself to be. "So you hit him." "I wanted to knock him down a peg. Make him show some humility. Make him—" She trailed off, the ugliness of her thoughts finally clear even to her. "Make him know his place," James supplied quietly. Victoria's face crumpled. Those were exactly the words she'd been avoiding, the words that revealed the depth of her prejudice. She nodded, tears streaming down her face, but James felt no sympathy. He had a 10-year-old daughter himself. "You need to understand something," he said, his voice professional but not unkind. "This isn't just about one slap. The airline's training videos have been leaked, the ones where you teach new hires how to identify suspicious passengers. The ones where every example is a person of color." Victoria's head snapped up. Those were confidential training materials. Nothing's confidential anymore, James replied. Not in this case. The FBI has seized all of the airline's training materials, and they're building a case that goes well beyond your individual actions. They're looking at institutional patterns of discrimination. I was just following protocol. Victoria protested weakly. I was teaching what I was taught. And that's exactly the problem. James nodded. The government isn't just after you. They're after the whole system. And right now you're the public face of that system. Victoria stared at her hands, realizing for the first time the true dimensions of what was happening. This wasn't just about her career or even her freedom. This was about an entire way of thinking being put on trial. My children, she whispered. What will happen to them? Your husband will take care of them, James assured her. But you need to think about what kind of world you want them to live in. Your son is biracial, Victoria. Someday he could be the one sitting in first class, having his right to be there questioned. What would you want to happen then? The question hit Victoria like a physical blow. The image of her son, her beautiful, sensitive 12-year-old, being treated the way she had treated Elijah Morrison, was unbearable. And yet, wasn't that exactly the world she had helped create? What can I do? She asked, her voice small. How do I fix this? You can't fix it, James said honestly. But you can be part of the change. The prosecutors are offering a deal: 6 months in federal prison, 3 years probation, and your full cooperation in the broader investigation. That means testifying about the training programs, the unwritten policies, everything you know about how discrimination was baked into the airline's operations. They'll hate me, Victoria said. My colleagues, the airline. They'll say I betrayed them. Maybe, James acknowledged. Or maybe you'll help create an industry where your own children will be treated with dignity. The choice is yours. Back at O'Hare, the aftermath continued to ripple through every department. Gate agents were being pulled into emergency sensitivity training. Pilots were being briefed on new protocols for handling discrimination incidents. Miguel Santos, the maintenance worker who'd saved the pieces of Elijah's notebook, had started a petition among ground crew workers demanding comprehensive reform. We've all seen it, Miguel told his colleagues in the break room. We've all known it was happening, and we've all stayed quiet. I can't do that anymore. Not after seeing that kid's face when she hit him. The petition was gaining signatures by the hour, not just from ground crew, but from flight attendants, gate agents, even pilots. The silence that had protected the status quo was breaking, replaced by a chorus of voices demanding change. In the executive boardroom, the debate had shifted from damage control to genuine transformation. Richard Patterson had just gotten off a call with the White House. The transportation secretary was considering a federal investigation into discriminatory practices across all airlines, sparked by Elijah's case. We have 2 choices, Patterson announced to his exhausted board. We can treat this as a PR crisis, to be managed. Throw Victoria under the bus. Make some token changes and hope it blows over. Or we can use this as a catalyst for real change. Become the airline that doesn't just apologize for discrimination, but actively works to eliminate it. The second option will cost us hundreds of millions, Margaret Lewis pointed out. The first option will cost us our soul, Gabriela Hernandez countered. And probably our company. The Morrison family isn't going away. Their foundation has already announced they're creating a watchdog program for airline discrimination. They're funding it with $50 million initially. They're in this for the long haul. My daughter asked me this morning if I worked for the racist airline, one board member said quietly. She's 7. That's how our brand is being perceived now by children. The news of the Morrison Foundation's initiative had broken that morning, sending another shockwave through the industry. The foundation would provide legal support for victims of airline discrimination, maintain a public database of incidents, and score airlines on their inclusivity practices. It was corporate accountability with teeth. Meanwhile, federal investigators had made a devastating discovery, training videos featuring Victoria Blackwell herself, instructing new flight attendants on how to identify suspicious passengers. The criteria she outlined were thinly veiled instructions for racial profiling. Watch for passengers who seem out of place, Victoria said in the video, which had been standard training material for 5 years. Those who are dressed inappropriately for their cabin class, who seem nervous or overly confident, who can't immediately produce documentation, or whose documentation requires extra verification. The video continued with examples all featuring passengers of color whose behavior was interpreted as suspicious, while identical behavior from white passengers was deemed unremarkable. When this evidence was presented to the airline board, the atmosphere in the room shifted from crisis management to genuine horror. They had not only allowed discrimination, they had institutionalized it, codified it, trained it into every new hire. This video was approved by senior management, the investigator pointed out. It was shown to every new flight attendant for half a decade. This isn't just about Victoria Blackwell. This is about a culture that taught her that prejudice was protocol. William Hargrove, who had earlier defended Victoria, looked physically ill. "I signed off on those training materials," he admitted. "I never even questioned the examples. I just saw them as standard security procedures." "That's exactly the problem," Gabriella said. "Discrimination hiding in plain sight, disguised as security, disguised as protocol, disguised as common sense. But when you look at the actual outcomes, the pattern is unmistakable." As the implications sank in, Richard Patterson made the decision that would define the rest of his career. Effective immediately, all current training materials are suspended. "Gabriella, you have full authority and an unlimited budget to rebuild our training from the ground up, and I expect my resignation letter to be accepted by the board by end of day." The announcement was met with stunned silence, then a slow nod from each board member. The rot was too deep for half measures. "If you're resigning, I should too," Williams said. "I was more directly involved in the training programs." No, Patterson countered. "I need you to stay and face this. Run toward the fire, not away from it. Use your position to make real change. That's harder than resigning, and it's what the company needs right now." Not everyone agreed with the direction. Several board members raised concerns about liability, about admitting fault, about the precedent it would set. The debate grew heated. "If we admit we've been discriminating, we'll be sued into oblivion," one board member argued. "We're already being sued," Gabriella shot back. "The question is whether we fight a losing battle or use this moment to create meaningful change. The shareholders will revolt," another warned. "The shareholders are already revolting," Margaret pointed out, showing the stock price in free fall. "Our choice isn't between pain and no pain. It's between pain with purpose and pain without it." By the end of the day, a new path forward had been charted, one that acknowledged the failures of the past and committed to fundamental reform. It was risky, expensive, and without precedent in corporate America. But it was also perhaps the only way forward. The ripples extended far beyond the airline industry. Schools were incorporating Elijah's story into lessons about dignity and justice. Parents were having difficult conversations with their children about prejudice and privilege. Corporations were examining their own training materials for coded language that might enable discrimination. But not all reactions were positive. Online, a backlash was brewing. Comment sections filled with people defending Victoria, claiming Elijah must have done something to provoke her, suggesting the whole incident was staged to extract a settlement. "The kid was obviously coached," wrote one commenter. "No 10-year-old is that composed unless they're following a script." "What about Victoria's rights?" demanded another. Trial by social media is destroying lives before all the facts come out. Not everything is about race, insisted a third. Maybe she was just having a bad day. These voices were a minority, but they were loud and persistent. They found their way onto cable news segments, into radio call-in shows, even into political speeches. "We're seeing an overreaction," said one pundit. "One unfortunate incident is being used to smear an entire industry, an entire way of doing business. Are we really going to let one slap change everything?" For Elijah, these reactions were perhaps the hardest part. Not the slap itself, but the aftermath. The people who refused to see what was right in front of them, who would rather deny reality than confront uncomfortable truths. "They're saying, I must have done something wrong," he told his father, who had finally arrived from Singapore. "They're saying, I deserved it." Dominic Morrison pulled his son close. "That's how it always works, son. First they hurt you, then they blame you for being hurt. It's easier than admitting they were wrong." "Will it always be like this?" Elijah asked, his voice small. "No," Dominic said firmly. "That's why we fight. Not just for justice today, but for a different tomorrow. A world where you don't have to be perfect, just to be treated with basic dignity." In a courtroom across town, Victoria Blackwell stood before Judge Margaret Young, the irony not lost on anyone that her fate would be decided by an Asian American woman who'd likely faced her own discrimination in rising to the federal bench. "Ms. Blackwell," Judge Young began, her voice stern, but not without compassion. "You assaulted a child. You violated the trust placed in you as a flight attendant. You perpetuated a pattern of discrimination that has harmed countless passengers. However, your cooperation with federal investigators and your willingness to testify about institutional practices are noted." Victoria had been allowed to make a statement. She stood in her orange jumpsuit, a stark contrast to the professional uniform she'd once worn with pride. "I want to address Elijah Morrison directly, though I understand he's not here today," she began, her voice shaking. "Elijah, I struck you because I was afraid of your confidence, afraid of your belonging in spaces I felt I'd earned through years of work while you seemed to inhabit them naturally. That fear came from prejudice I didn't even recognize in myself until it exploded in violence." She paused, struggling with words she'd rehearsed, but which still felt inadequate. "I was trained to see threat where there was none, to question legitimacy based on appearance, to enforce unwritten rules about who belongs where. But I also chose to embrace that training, to excel at it, to pass it on to others. Both the culture and I are guilty. Your forgiveness, which I don't deserve, has haunted me because it shows a grace I never possessed." Judge Young delivered the sentence: 6 months in federal prison, 3 years probation, 500 hours of community service, specifically with organizations serving children of color, and a lifetime prohibition from working in any transportation industry. As Victoria was led away, one voice called out from the gallery. It was Mrs. Eleanor Jackson, the elderly woman who'd filmed the assault. "Ms. Blackwell," she said, causing Victoria to pause, "your sentence isn't your ending. It's your opportunity to begin again. Don't waste it." That evening, the Morrison family returned to their Chicago home for the first time since the incident. Elijah's 8-year-old sister Zoe, who'd been staying with her grandmother, rushed to hug her brother as soon as he walked through the door. "You're famous," she said with the directness of a child. "Are you okay? Did it hurt when she hit you?" Elijah hugged her tightly. "It hurt a little, but I'm okay now. I would have kicked her," Zoe declared with fierce loyalty, making their parents exchange a glance that mixed amusement with sadness. "That wouldn't have helped," Elijah explained gently. "It would have just made things worse." "But it's not fair," Zoe insisted, her eyes filling with tears, that her brother wouldn't shed. "You didn't do anything wrong." "No, I didn't." Elijah agreed. "And that's what matters. Not what she did, but what I did. I stayed true to who I am." Zoe considered this with the serious concentration of a child trying to understand adult complexities. "Can I sleep in your room tonight?" she finally asked. "Just in case you get scared." Elijah smiled a real smile, perhaps his first since the incident. "Sure, Zoe. That would be nice." Later that night, with Zoe asleep beside him, Elijah lay awake thinking about everything that had happened. He was exhausted, yet unable to sleep. The weight of what had occurred, what was still occurring, pressed down on him. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake his sister, and went to his desk. There, in the soft glow of his desk lamp, he opened a new notebook, not the public one he showed everyone, but a private one, just for him. "I'm tired," he wrote. "Tired of being brave. Tired of being composed. Tired of being perfect. Sometimes, I just want to be a kid who can make mistakes, who can get angry, who can be messy and loud and normal. But I can't. Because someone is always watching, always judging, always ready to use my humanity against me." He paused, pen hovering over the page. "But I'm also proud," he continued. "Proud that I didn't let her win. Proud that I used what happened to me to help others. Proud that I'm making a difference. I just wish it didn't have to be this way. I wish I could make a difference just by being me, not by being a symbol, or an example, or a case study." He closed the notebook and returned to bed, curling protectively around his sister. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more cameras, more expectations. But for now, in the quiet dark of his room, he could just be Elijah, a 10-year-old boy who had seen too much of the world's ugliness, but still believed in its capacity for beauty. The weeks that followed saw change accelerating at a pace few had thought possible. The Morrison Foundation for Dignity in Travel was launched with a press conference that crashed the foundation's website due to overwhelming traffic. Donations poured in from individuals and corporations alike, quickly surpassing the initial $50 million commitment. Dr. Imani Morrison outlined their three-pronged approach: legal support for victims of discrimination, data collection and transparency, and education for both travelers and industry employees. But the most innovative proposal came from Elijah himself, who'd been invited to share his ideas with the foundation's board. Standing before a room of accomplished adults, the 10-year-old presented his vision with remarkable clarity. "I want to create an app," he said, pulling up a simple mock-up he designed with his father's help. "Kids can report incidents in real time with automatic recording features and GPS tracking. But more than that, it connects them with other kids who've experienced similar things. No one should feel alone when facing discrimination." The board approved his proposal unanimously, with several members wiping away tears. The Morrison Network, as it would be called, would launch within 6 months, potentially protecting millions of children worldwide. Behind closed doors, though, Imani worried about the toll all of this was taking on her son. The public appearances, the constant retelling of his trauma, the pressure to be the perfect victim, calm, articulate, forgiving, yet firm in his demands for justice. "Are we asking too much of him?" she asked Dominic late one night after Elijah had finally fallen asleep. "He's 10. He should be building robots and playing video games, not designing anti-discrimination apps and giving speeches." Dominic sighed, the weight of their shared dilemma evident in the lines around his eyes. "I ask myself that every day. But then I think about what the alternative would be: to let what happened to him go unanswered, to let that flight attendant's actions be the last word. Would that be better for him?" "I don't know," Imani admitted. "I just know he's carrying so much on those small shoulders. And I'm not sure we're doing enough to help him put it down sometimes. Maybe we need to create more space for him to just be a kid, Dominic suggested. Set boundaries on the public appearances, the interviews, the strategy sessions. Make sure he has time. That's just for him, where he doesn't have to be Elijah Morrison's symbol of resistance, but just Elijah who likes Star Wars and struggles with spelling. Imani nodded, determination setting her features. You're right. Starting tomorrow, we restructure. The foundation work happens during school hours only. Evenings and weekends are for family time, for normalcy, for childhood. The world can wait. Meanwhile, airline executives from every major carrier had gathered for an unprecedented joint meeting. Competition had been set aside in the face of an existential threat to their industry. The public had lost faith in their ability to treat passengers with basic dignity, and no amount of PR could fix that without real change. We need industry-wide standards, argued the CEO of a major carrier. If one airline discriminates, we all suffer. Elijah Morrison has become a symbol, and symbols are powerful. Every parent booking a flight is now wondering if their child will be the next Elijah. They agreed to establish an independent oversight board funded by the airlines, but operated entirely by civil rights organizations. Every complaint would be investigated, every incident documented, and airlines that failed to meet standards would face public censure and potential loss of operating licenses. It was self-regulation with teeth born from the fear of federal intervention that would be far worse. Not everyone in the industry embraced these changes. A vocal minority of employees, particularly those with longer tenures, resisted what they saw as an overreaction to an isolated incident. We're letting one bratty kid and his wealthy parents dictate industry policy, complained one pilot in a private forum that quickly leaked to the press. Next thing you know, we won't be allowed to question anyone about anything, and security will go out the window. The backlash to the backlash was swift and severe. The pilot was suspended pending investigation, and the airline issued a statement distancing itself from his comments. But the incident revealed the depth of the resistance to change, even in the face of overwhelming public support for reform. At her first major press conference as interim CEO, Gabriela Hernandez announced the airline's comprehensive response, complete retraining of all customer-facing staff, an independent review of every discrimination complaint from the past decade, financial settlements for verified victims, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. What happened to Elijah Morrison was not an isolated incident, she acknowledged frankly. It was the inevitable result of a culture that prioritized certain passengers over others, that taught employees to see differences as threats, and that buried complaints instead of addressing them. That culture ends today. The stock market responded with cautious optimism. While the airline's shares were still down significantly, they'd stopped free-falling. Investors recognized that genuine change, while expensive, was the only path to survival. A month after the incident, a remarkable meeting took place. Victoria Blackwell, now serving her sentence in a minimum security facility, received an unexpected visitor request. Elijah Morrison wanted to meet with her. The meeting was private, no media, no lawyers, just a child, and the woman who'd assaulted him, separated by reinforced glass. Victoria could barely look at him. This child whose dignity had exposed her ugliness to the world. I wanted to understand, Elijah said simply. Not forgive, I already did that. But understand what made you so angry at me. Victoria struggled to find words that wouldn't sound like excuses. You represented everything I'd been taught to resent: your confidence, your belonging, your refusal to be diminished. I'd spent my whole life following rules, deferring to authority, accepting my place. You didn't defer. You didn't accept being challenged. You stood up for yourself in a way I never could. So you hit me. So I hit you. Victoria confirmed the shame, fresh as the first day. I wanted to break something in you that I'd lost in myself. Elijah was quiet for a long moment. Did you find it? Whatever you lost. Did hitting me help you find it? Victoria's eyes filled with tears. No, but losing everything else did. Rock bottom has a way of showing you who you really are. I'm not who I thought I was, but maybe I can become who I should have been. She hesitated, then asked a question that had been haunting her. How did you know to document everything? How did you stay so calm when I was falling apart? Elijah's expression turned inward, remembering. When I was 7, a store security guard followed me around a toy store while my dad was parking the car. I was just looking at Legos, but he kept asking where my parents were, if I had money, if I was lost. My dad found me crying in the bathroom. Victoria winced, recognizing herself in that security guard. That night, my dad gave me my first notebook and taught me to document everything. Elijah continued. He said that one day my words might be the only witness I had. My mom taught me breathing techniques to stay calm when people try to make me feel small. My grandma taught me that dignity isn't just a feeling. It's a practice, a discipline. They had to teach you all that. At 7, Victoria asked the full weight of what Black parents had to prepare their children for finally hitting her. They had to. Elijah nodded. Because the world wasn't going to change fast enough for me to just be a kid. So I had to be ready. The simplicity of his explanation broke something open in Victoria, the last defense against fully seeing what she had done, what she had been part of. I'm so sorry. She whispered the words, inadequate but necessary. Not just for hitting you, but for making the world a place where children have to be strategists, instead of just children. Elijah stood to leave, then paused. Ms. Blackwell, you have 3 years of probation after your sentence. My mother's foundation runs programs for formerly incarcerated people working with at-risk youth. When you're ready, if you're really committed to change, we could use people who understand how prejudice develops and how it can be unlearned. The offer hung in the air, redemption extended by the very child she'd wronged. It was more grace than Victoria felt she deserved. But perhaps that was the point. As Elijah left the facility, his mother waiting in the car asked, "How do you feel?" "Free," Elijah replied. Not forgiving her would mean carrying her with me forever. Understanding her means I can leave her behind. But that night alone in his room, Elijah wrestled with more complicated feelings. His journal entry revealed the complexity behind his composed exterior. I told Mom, I feel free after talking to Ms. Blackwell, but the truth is more complicated. I do feel lighter, but also confused. She seems so normal, so human, not like a monster at all, just a person who did a terrible thing. And that's almost scarier, that regular people can do such hurtful things and not even realize why until it's too late. While Victoria contemplated her future, her husband Daniel Blackwell was grappling with his own role in what had happened. He held a press conference outside their modest suburban home, their children visible through the window, being comforted by their grandmother. I failed, he said simply, his voice breaking. I saw Victoria's attitudes, heard her comments about certain passengers, noticed how she talked about her work. I dismissed it as work stress, as venting, as anything but what it was. Prejudice that was growing stronger every year. I was complicit through my silence, through my failure to challenge her, through my comfort in not seeing what I didn't want to see. He held up a photograph of their family from happier times. My children are biracial. Their mother assaulted a child who looks like they might in a few years. The contradiction is unbearable, but it's also real. Victoria loved our children while harboring prejudice against children who looked like them. That cognitive dissonance exists in too many families, too many hearts. It has to end. His statement went viral within hours, particularly among mixed-race families grappling with similar contradictions. Daniel Blackwell became an unexpected voice in the conversation about how prejudice can coexist with love, how people can discriminate against strangers while believing they're not racist because they have black friends, colleagues, or even family. It's easy to love individuals, he told a reporter in a follow-up interview. It's harder to examine the systems we participate in, the assumptions we make about groups of people we don't know. That's the work we all need to do, not just celebrating our diversity, but confronting our biases. His 12-year-old son, Marcus, was struggling to make sense of what his mother had done. "Does Mom hate black people?" he asked his father one evening. "Does she hate part of me?" Daniel pulled his son close. "No, buddy. She loves you, all of you. But she had some wrong ideas about people. She didn't know people who looked different from her. And those wrong ideas made her do something terrible. Now she's learning why those ideas were wrong." "Will she go to jail forever?" Marcus asked, his voice small. "Not forever," Daniel assured him. 6 months, and then she'll come home, and we'll all work on healing together." "Will people hate us forever?" Marcus persisted. Daniel hesitated, not wanting to lie. "Some people might be angry for a long time, but we'll get through this as a family. And maybe if we're honest about what happened and work to make things better, some good can come from it." Marcus considered this. "Like what happened to that kid Elijah. Can I meet him someday?" "Would you want to?" Daniel asked, surprised. "Yeah." Marcus nodded. "He seems brave. I want to tell him I'm sorry for what Mom did." Daniel felt a glimmer of hope. If his 12-year-old could see the path forward so clearly, perhaps there was reason for optimism after all. On the legal front, the consequences continued to unfold. The Department of Justice wasn't just pursuing Victoria Blackwell. They were launching a criminal investigation into the airline's entire leadership structure, including board members who had ignored years of discrimination complaints. They found emails Samantha Roberts, the Morrisons' lead attorney, explained, her voice carrying barely contained excitement. Internal communications going back a decade, showing executives deliberately ignored patterns of discrimination because addressing them would require admitting liability. One board member actually wrote, "As long as we can settle quietly, let the flight attendants handle passengers however they see fit." They knew, Dominic said, setting down his coffee cup with controlled precision. They all knew. More than that, Samantha continued, "We've uncovered a training video from 2020 where Victoria Blackwell herself is teaching new flight attendants how to identify suspicious passengers. The criteria she lists are essentially a guide to racial profiling. This video was approved by senior management and shown to every new hire for 5 years. The discovery of these materials transformed the case from an incident of individual prejudice to a corporate conspiracy to enable discrimination. Former executives were facing criminal charges. Current board members were resigning in disgrace. The airline that had once been an industry leader was now a cautionary tale. But amidst the legal battles and corporate restructuring, quiet acts of healing were taking place. Miguel Santos, the maintenance worker who'd collected the torn pieces of Elijah's notebook, had carefully preserved them. Through the airline's HR department, he'd managed to contact the Morrison family. "I couldn't throw them away," he explained when he met with Elijah to return the fragments. "Your words deserve to be remembered even in pieces, maybe especially in pieces, because they show what you endured and overcame." Elijah spent hours arranging the fragments, seeing his handwriting from that morning, notes about aviation history, observations about cloud formations, a sketch of an airplane he'd designed. Such innocent documentation before it became evidence of assault. He decided to frame the pieces as they were torn and scattered, but still readable. It would hang in the Morrison network offices, a reminder of why their work mattered. Lucia Rodriguez, the flight attendant who'd tried to intervene, had become a powerful advocate for industry reform. Standing before a conference of airline employees, she shared her own culpability. "I saw Victoria's prejudice for years and said nothing," she admitted. "I prioritized keeping the peace over protecting passengers." Every one of us who stayed silent enabled what happened to Elijah Morrison. Our silence was complicity. Her words sparked a movement within the industry: flight attendants, pilots, and ground crew coming forward with their own stories of witnessing discrimination, creating a collective testimony that made denial impossible. I watched a colleague accidentally spill coffee on a black passenger who complained about service one flight attendant revealed. I watched another deliberately skip over people of color during meal service in first class. I did nothing. I said nothing. I am part of the problem. These testimonies, collected and published with permission, became part of the industry's reckoning, not just with individual bad actors, but with a culture that had normalized discrimination through silence and inaction. For Victoria, watching this unfold from her prison cell, the weight of her actions grew heavier and lighter simultaneously. Heavier, because she saw the full scope of the harm she had caused, and been part of; lighter, because she was no longer carrying the burden of denial. "I want to speak," she told her lawyer during a visit. "Not just about what I did to Elijah, but about the whole system. About how we were trained, what we were taught, what was rewarded, and what was punished. I want to help tear it down." James Powell studied his client carefully. "This won't reduce your sentence," he warned. "It might even make things harder for you when you get out. Some of your former colleagues will see it as betrayal." "I know," Victoria nodded. "But I've already betrayed the only people who really matter: my children. I can't undo what I did to Elijah, but I can try to make sure it doesn't happen to other children, including my own." The decision was made. Victoria would provide a full account of the airline's discriminatory practices. The formal training, the informal expectations, the ways performance was evaluated based on passenger management, that often meant keeping certain travelers in their place. Her testimony, combined with the documentary evidence already collected, would form the backbone of both the federal case against the airline and the reform efforts being implemented across the industry. But for Victoria herself, the most difficult conversation still lay ahead, explaining to her children not just what she had done, but why she had done it, and how she was trying to make amends. "I was wrong," she told them during a supervised visit, Marcus and his younger sister Lily, sitting across from her in the prison visiting room. "Not just for hitting Elijah, but for the way I thought about people who are different from me. I'm learning now, but I should have learned sooner. I'm sorry that my mistakes have hurt you. Will you still love us when you get out?" 8-year-old Lily asked, her eyes wide with worry. "Oh, baby," Victoria said, her heart breaking. "I will always love you. Always. Nothing could ever change that. Even though we're part black." Marcus asked directly, his gaze challenging her to complete honesty. Victoria met his eyes, refusing to look away from the hurt she had caused. "I love you because of everything you are, every part of you. I was wrong to treat people differently because of their skin color. So wrong. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure I never make that mistake again." It wasn't enough. No words could be. But it was a beginning. A first step on a long road toward healing, not just for her family, but for all the families affected by the discrimination she had perpetuated. The Morrison Network app launched 6 months after the incident with Elijah, demonstrating its features at a tech conference, ironically, in the same first-class seat configuration where he'd been assaulted. The symmetry wasn't lost on the audience, who gave him a standing ovation. The app allowed young travelers to document incidents in real time, automatically saving audio, video, and location data to secure cloud storage that parents could access. It included an emergency alert function, resources for understanding passenger rights, and a community forum where kids could share experiences and support each other. This isn't just about catching bad behavior, Elijah explained to the audience. It's about preventing it. When people know they're being recorded, when they know there's accountability, they behave differently. And when they don't, there's evidence. The app was downloaded over 1 million times in its first week. Airlines, initially wary, quickly realized it was in their interest to cooperate with the Morrison network rather than fight it. Several major carriers added direct reporting links to their own apps, integrated training based on documented incidents, and implemented real-time monitoring of customer service interactions. Behind the scenes, Elijah was starting to feel the strain of his public role. The tech conference had been his 5th public appearance that month, each one requiring him to revisit the trauma of the slap, to be the composed, articulate victim whose dignity made his case unassailable. "I'm tired, Dad," he admitted that night in their hotel room. "I'm tired of talking about it, of being Elijah from the plane. I want to go back to being just Elijah." Dominic sat beside his son on the edge of the bed. "You don't have to do any more interviews or appearances if you don't want to. The foundation can continue without you being the public face." Elijah considered this. "But if I stop, will people forget? Will things go back to how they were?" "The change has already begun," Dominic assured him. "You've done more than enough, more than anyone should ask of a 10-year-old. It's okay to step back now and just be a kid." Elijah nodded slowly. "Maybe after the ceremony at O'Hare next month. That feels important. But after that, I think I want a break." "A break sounds good," Dominic agreed. "Maybe we should plan that trip to space camp you've been talking about." For the first time in months, Elijah's face lit up with pure, uncomplicated excitement. "Really? You mean it?" "Absolutely," Dominic promised. "It's time for you to reach for the stars instead of carrying the weight of the world." Meanwhile, Victoria Blackwell was approaching the halfway point of her sentence. She'd become a model prisoner working in the facility's education program and developing a curriculum about recognizing and addressing implicit bias. Her personal journey from perpetrator to educator was being documented for potential use in diversity training across industries. In a letter to her lawyer, she wrote, "I never thought I'd say this, but being stripped of everything has been the most valuable experience of my life. I'm facing parts of myself I spent decades avoiding, prejudices I inherited, resentments I nurtured, fears I never examined. I'm not asking for forgiveness or a reduced sentence. I'm simply acknowledging that justice sometimes looks like being forced to become the person you should have been all along." Her lawyer shared the letter with the Morrison family's legal team, who were monitoring Victoria's progress. Imani read it with the clinical detachment of a surgeon assessing a treatment's effectiveness. "She's sincere," she told Dominic afterward. "Whether that translates to lasting change remains to be seen, but she's doing the work. That's more than most in her position would do." "Do you think she could actually be valuable to the foundation?" Dominic asked, referring to Elijah's offer. "I think people who've walked both sides of a divide can build the strongest bridges," Imani replied. "But that decision will be up to Elijah when the time comes. It's his forgiveness to give or withhold." Not everyone was ready to see Victoria as anything but a villain. Online forums still buzzed with outrage, with calls for harsher punishment, with assertions that she was only changing to reduce her sentence. The path to redemption would not be smooth or straight, but in quiet ways, the ground was shifting. Daniel Blackwell had become an unexpected ally in the fight against discrimination, speaking at schools and community centers about recognizing and addressing prejudice in everyday life. "The most dangerous bias is the one you don't know you have," he would tell audiences. "The assumptions so deeply embedded that you mistake them for common sense or natural caution. Those are the ones that can make a decent person do an indecent thing in an unguarded moment." His courage in facing his own complicity inspired others to do the same. A support group formed for partners and family members of people who had been publicly exposed for discriminatory behavior. They shared strategies for holding loved ones accountable while still offering support for talking to children about what had happened, for rebuilding relationships damaged by the revelation of prejudice. The conversation was expanding, moving beyond the binary of racist and not racist to explore the complex reality of how bias operates, how it can coexist with love and good intentions, how it can be recognized and addressed before it causes harm. It was messy, uncomfortable work, the kind that rarely made headlines, but that was perhaps more important than any policy change or corporate restructuring. The quiet daily practice of becoming better than we have been. 1 year to the day after Victoria's palm struck Elijah's cheek, he stood in the East Room of the White House, receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the youngest recipient in history. He looked small, but undaunted at the podium, still carrying his notebook, still documenting everything. "This medal doesn't belong to me alone," Elijah said, his voice clear and strong. "It belongs to every child who's been made to feel less than, to every parent who's had to explain why the world sees their baby as a threat, to every person who spoke up when they saw injustice. Change doesn't come from one person's courage. It comes from collective conscience finally saying, 'Enough.'" The audience erupted in applause, but Elijah wasn't finished. "A year ago, I was just a kid trying to visit my grandmother. Today, I'm still just a kid, but one who's learned that sometimes standing up to hatred means standing up for love, love of dignity, love of justice, love of the future we want to build together." Victoria watched the ceremony from the prison library, where she now taught literacy classes to other inmates. Several gathered around the small television, knowing her connection to the boy on screen. "That's the kid you hit?" one woman asked in disbelief. "That's the kid who saved me from who I was becoming," Victoria corrected. "I hit him, and he responded by changing the world. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to earn the forgiveness he gave me freely." As the ceremony ended, Elijah returned to his seat between his parents, his sister Zoe on his lap. The president had called him a hero, but Elijah didn't feel heroic. He felt tired, ready to return to being just a kid, to building robots with his dad and reading stories to Zoe. But he also understood that his story had become bigger than him. Every day he received letters from children around the world, sharing their own experiences, finding courage in his example. The notebook he carried was no longer just for documentation. It was for recording the changes, small and large, that proved progress was possible. That evening, the Morrison family had dinner at the White House, a surreal experience that Zoe navigated with characteristic 8-year-old honesty, asking the president why the portions were so small, and if they had any regular milk instead of the fancy kind. As they prepared to leave, the president pulled Elijah aside. "You know, most people who receive this medal are at the end of remarkable lives. You're at the beginning. What do you want to do with the platform you've built?" Elijah thought carefully. "I want to make it so no other kid needs to be this brave. I want courage to be a choice, not a necessity. I want children to fly without fear." The president smiled. "That's a worthy goal. How do we get there?" "One flight at a time," Elijah replied. "One person choosing to see children as children. One adult deciding protection matters more than prejudice. It's not complicated. It's just hard, because it requires admitting we've been wrong." Later that night in his journal, Elijah wrote about the contradiction he felt. "Today, everyone called me brave and extraordinary. But real success would be a world where what I did would be ordinary, where standing up for yourself and being treated with dignity wouldn't be remarkable at all. I'm proud of what we've accomplished, but I'm still dreaming of the day when kids like me can just be kids not symbols or examples or cautionary tales. 2 weeks after the White House ceremony, Victoria Blackwell was released from prison, having served her full 6-month sentence. She emerged to a world transformed partly by her actions, a world where airlines now competed on their inclusivity metrics, where flight attendant training included extensive sections on implicit bias, and where the Morrison network had successfully intervened in over 300 incidents involving children. Her first act as a free woman was to visit the plaque at O'Hare, standing before it, not in shame, but in reflection. As she read the words again, "May we always protect innocence, defend dignity, and choose love over fear," she felt someone standing beside her. "I heard you were being released today," Elijah said quietly. "I thought you might come here." Victoria turned surprised. "I didn't expect to see you." "I've been thinking about my offer," Elijah replied. "About you working with the foundation. Are you still interested?" Victoria studied him carefully, the child she'd struck now standing taller, more confident than ever. "Why would you want me there?" "There must be hundreds of people more qualified. None who understand both sides like you do," Elijah said simply. "You can reach people others can't. You can speak to the fears they won't admit to anyone else." Victoria nodded slowly. "I'd like to try, if you'll have me." "It won't be easy," Elijah warned. "There are people who will never forgive you, who will see your involvement as an insult to everything we're fighting for." "I know," Victoria acknowledged. "But if this past year has taught me anything, it's that the hardest paths are often the most necessary ones." They stood side by side watching travelers rush past families, business people, children, clutching stuffed animals. Each person passing the plaque without noticing it, yet each benefiting from the changes it represented. "Does it still bother you?" Victoria asked hesitantly. "When you fly, do you still feel afraid?" Elijah considered the question. "Not afraid. Aware. I still notice how flight attendants look at me when I board. I still prepare my documents before anyone can ask for them. I still record every flight just in case. But I don't expect the worst anymore. That's progress, I suppose." "I'm sorry." Victoria said the words still inadequate but necessary. "Not just for hitting you, but for making the world a place where children have to be strategists instead of just children." "I know," Elijah replied. "That's why I want you at the foundation. Because you understand the cost of prejudice, not just to those who face it, but to those who harbor it. You lost everything because of a moment of hatred. That's a powerful lesson to share." As they parted ways, Elijah to meet his family, Victoria to begin her community service, neither knew exactly what the future held. But both understood that their intertwined stories had already created ripples that would continue long after this moment. Victoria's journey from perpetrator to advocate would not erase what she'd done, but it would transform it into something that could prevent others from making the same choices. And Elijah's journey from victim to changemaker would not erase the trauma of that slap, but it would ensure that its legacy was one of healing rather than hurt. The proposal for Victoria to join the foundation was not universally welcomed. Several board members resigned in protest. Social media erupted with accusations that the Morrisons were betraying their cause. Even within the family, there were mixed feelings. "Are we sure about this?" Imani asked Dominic that night. "Having her as the face of our anti-discrimination efforts feels complicated." "Elijah's sure," Dominic replied. "And it's his forgiveness to give. Besides, who better to recognize discrimination than someone who's had to face their own prejudice? She's a walking case study in how bias operates and how it can be overcome." "I just worry about the optics," Imani admitted. "About people thinking we're letting her off the hook." "She served her sentence," Dominic pointed out. "This isn't about letting her off the hook. It's about putting her experience to use. and sending a message that people can change, that redemption is possible. Isn't that the world we want to build? Imani sighed. Yes, but it's so much easier in theory than in practice, especially when it's your child who was hurt. I know, Dominic agreed. But Elijah sees something in her that's worth salvaging. Maybe we should trust his judgment. The conversation continued in homes and offices across the country about forgiveness and accountability, about punishment and rehabilitation, about what justice really looks like in a world that needs healing more than vengeance. There were no easy answers, no perfect solutions, but in the messy, complicated human process of working it out, something important was happening. People were talking honestly about prejudice, about harm, about healing in ways they hadn't before. And that perhaps was the most significant change of all. Elijah's return to school after the White House ceremony brought its own challenges. His classmates treated him with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Was he still the same Elijah who loved robotics and struggled with spelling? Or was he now some untouchable symbol they couldn't relate to? His teacher, Mrs. Patterson, pulled him aside one day. "How do you want to handle this?" "Elijah, you're entitled to privacy, to boundaries." Elijah appreciated her concern. "Can we have one day where we talk about it openly? Let everyone ask their questions and then move on. I don't want to be the kid who got slapped forever. I want to be the kid who's really good at robotics and occasionally burns cookies in home ec." The class discussion was remarkable. Children asked questions adults were too polite to voice. Why didn't you cry? Were you scared? Do you hate all flight attendants now? Elijah answered honestly, creating a safe space for his classmates to share their own experiences with discrimination, bullying, and standing up for themselves. One boy, Timothy, raised his hand hesitantly. "My dad says you're making everything about race. That if you just acted normal, nothing would have happened." The class held its breath, but Elijah responded calmly. "Ask your dad what acting normal means when you're the only black kid in first class. Ask him if having your documents repeatedly checked is normal. Ask him if being slapped for sitting in your assigned seat is normal. Then ask him whose definition of normal we're using." Timothy nodded thoughtfully. "I'll ask him." "And Elijah, I'm sorry that happened to you. It wasn't normal. It was wrong." After that day, something shifted. Elijah was allowed to be just Elijah again. Brilliant at math, terrible at basketball, passionate about space travel, annoyed by his little sister, and planning the most ambitious science fair project the school had ever seen. At home, too, a new normal was emerging. The Morrison family still received threats. Hatred doesn't disappear overnight, but they also received countless messages of support. Dominic had implemented advanced security measures, but he'd also insisted that they continue living openly, refusing to let fear dictate their choices. "The moment we start hiding," he told his children, "is the moment they win." Zoe had appointed herself Elijah's personal protector, fiercely defending him on the playground when other kids asked insensitive questions. Her protective instinct both touched and amused her brother, who gently reminded her that he could fight his own battles. "I know you can," she replied with the wisdom of an 8-year-old, "but you shouldn't have to fight them alone." Dr. Imani Morrison had scaled back her surgical practice to focus on the foundation, which was already showing remarkable results. Discrimination complaints across airlines had dropped by 35% in the first year. Customer satisfaction among minority passengers had improved dramatically. And most importantly, children were reporting feeling safer when traveling. "We're not just changing policies," she told her board. "We're changing expectations. We're normalizing the idea that dignity isn't a privilege, it's a right." The Morrison Network app had expanded beyond aviation to include all forms of public transportation and accommodation. Children could now document their experiences on buses, trains, in hotels, and restaurants. The data collected was anonymous but powerful, revealing patterns of discrimination that had previously been dismissed as isolated incidents. Victoria Blackwell's inclusion in the Foundation's work continued to be controversial, but over time, her story told with unflinching honesty became one of the most effective tools in their arsenal. Her willingness to examine her own prejudice, to name it without excuses, provided a model for others to do the same. "I didn't think of myself as racist," she would explain in training sessions. "I had black friends. My husband is black. My children are biracial. I thought that immunized me from prejudice. But it didn't, because I never examined the assumptions I was making about people I didn't know. The snap judgments based on appearance, the different standards I applied without even realizing it." Her testimony was powerful precisely because it came from someone who had caused harm, who had faced consequences, who had done the hard work of changing. It offered a path forward for others who recognized themselves in her story, not excusing the harm, but showing that it was possible to become better. Michael Brooks, the former military officer who'd intervened on the plane, had established a bystander training program that was being implemented in schools, workplaces, and community centers across the country. His simple message, "If you see something, do something," was backed by practical strategies for safe intervention. "Most discrimination doesn't happen in dramatic moments," he explained to a group of high school students. "It happens in small, everyday interactions that add up over time. And most people who witness it want to help, but don't know how." That's what we're changing, giving people the tools to speak up effectively. Lucia Rodriguez had become a leader in airline union efforts to address discrimination. Her testimony about the culture of silence that had enabled Victoria's behavior had been instrumental in changing industry practices. "We were taught to prioritize passenger comfort over passenger dignity," she told a congressional committee, "to smooth over problems rather than address their root causes, to protect the airline's reputation rather than the passengers' rights." That approach created a system where discrimination could flourish as long as it didn't cause visible disruption. Her words had led to new whistleblower protections for airline employees who reported discriminatory behavior, removing one of the key barriers to accountability. Slowly, painfully, but steadily, change was happening not just in policies and procedures, but in the thousands of small interactions that make up daily life. The conversation Elijah had started with his dignity was continuing in classrooms and boardrooms, in homes and public spaces, creating a world slightly better than the one he had faced that day on Flight 527. 6 months after receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom, Elijah was invited to contribute to an exhibit at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. The curators wanted to display the fragments of his torn notebook alongside other artifacts of resistance and resilience. Elijah was hesitant at first. "It's just a notebook," he told his parents. "There are more important things to preserve." Sometimes the most powerful artifacts are the ordinary ones, his grandmother, Dr. Grace Morrison, explained. They show that history happens to regular people living regular lives. Your notebook wasn't just torn, it was silenced. And yet here we are still hearing its message. The exhibit opened on a rainy Tuesday in April. The Morrison family attended privately before the public opening. The torn fragments of Elijah's notebook were displayed in a clear case, carefully arranged to show both the violence of their destruction and the coherence of the thoughts they contained. Next to the display was a simple placard that read, "Notebook belonging to Elijah Morrison, age 10. Torn by flight attendant, Victoria Blackwell, during a discriminatory incident on Flight 527, April 15, 2024. The act of documentation of bearing witness to one's own experiences is itself a form of resistance." Elijah stood before the display for a long time, seeing his childish handwriting preserved as a historical artifact. It was surreal seeing his private thoughts, notes about cloud formations. The Wright brothers, a sketch of an airplane he'd designed, displayed for strangers to examine. "How does it feel?" his grandmother asked softly. "Strange," Elijah admitted. "I was just being me, writing things I thought were interesting. I never thought it would end up in a museum." "That's often how history works," Dr. Grace Morrison replied. "People just being themselves, standing their ground, documenting their truth, and suddenly they're part of something much larger." As they moved through the rest of the exhibit, Elijah saw his experience contextualized within a longer history of resistance from enslaved people who learned to read, despite prohibitions, to civil rights activists who documented abuses to his own generation, using technology to expose injustice. "We stand on the shoulders of giants," his grandmother reminded him. "Every generation finds new tools, but the struggle remains the same: to be seen as fully human, to have our dignity recognized, to exist without having to justify our existence." In another wing of the museum, a different exhibit had been installed, one focused on transformation and reconciliation. It featured Victoria Blackwell's training videos, alongside her later work with the Morrison Foundation, showing the journey from perpetuating discrimination to actively working against it. Some visitors had objected to her inclusion, arguing that it centered the perpetrator rather than the victims of discrimination. But the curators had made a deliberate choice to show both sides of the story: the harm and the healing, the injury and the repair. "We cannot talk about justice without talking about transformation," the exhibit text explained. "About the possibility of becoming better than we have been. About the hard, messy, necessary work of addressing the biases that live within us all." That evening, as the family drove home, Elijah was quieter than usual, processing the weight of seeing his personal experience preserved as history. "Are you okay?" his mother asked. "I'm thinking about Victoria," he replied unexpectedly. "Her training videos are in the museum too, in the section about institutional discrimination. Her worst moment preserved forever, just like mine." "Does that bother you?" Dominic asked. Elijah considered the question. "Not exactly. It's just strange how our worst day became something that helps other people understand. Neither of us wanted to be symbols, but here we are." "That's the power of truth," Amani said. "Once it's documented, it takes on a life of its own. That's why they tried to silence you, not just by slapping you, but by destroying your notebook. They knew instinctively that your words had power. And now they're in a museum," Elijah said with a small smile. "I guess that's a kind of justice too." Summer arrived, bringing with it Elijah's 11th birthday and a trip to visit his grandmother in New York, the journey he'd been attempting when Victoria had slapped him. This time, the family traveled together, Zoe chattering excitedly about seeing the Statue of Liberty, Dominic and Amani exchanging amused glances over their children's heads. At the airport, Elijah moved through security with practiced ease, his documentation ready, his composure intact. But there was a difference now, a lightness that hadn't been there before. He wasn't anticipating confrontation at every turn. He was just a kid going to visit his grandmother. As they approached the gate, a flight attendant recognized him, not unusual given his public profile. But instead of awkwardness or overcompensation, she simply smiled and said, "Good morning, Mr. Morrison. We're honored to have you flying with us today." "Thank you," Elijah replied politely. "It's just Elijah, though." "Of course, Elijah," she corrected herself. "Your family is pre-boarding whenever you're ready." As they settled into their seats, Elijah still in 2A, a small act of reclamation. Zoe peppered him with questions about the flight, the plane, the clouds they'd see. Her excitement was contagious, reminding Elijah of his own love of aviation, before it had become complicated by other experiences. "Will you be scared?" Zoe whispered, as the boarding continued around them. Because of what happened last time, Elijah shook his head. I wasn't scared then, Zoe. I was sad. Sad that someone could look at me and not see me. Just see something that didn't belong. But I'm not sad now. Because you won. Zoe asked, her concept of justice still forming. Because things are changing, Elijah corrected gently. Not perfect, not fixed, but changing. And that's worth being happy about. As the plane took off climbing through layers of cloud into crystal blue sky, Elijah pulled out his notebook, a new one, leather-bound, a gift from Mrs. Eleanor Jackson, who'd become something of a surrogate grandmother to him. He began to write not about discrimination or injustice or protocols, but about the beauty of flight itself, the miracle of human ingenuity that had allowed us to soar above the clouds to see the world from perspectives our ancestors could only dream of. What are you writing? Zoe asked, trying to peek at his notebook. About flying, Elijah replied. About how humans figured out how to do something that seemed impossible. Like changing how people treat each other, Zoe asked with unexpected insight. Elijah smiled at his sister. Exactly like that. 3 days into their New York visit, Victoria Blackwell began her work with the Morrison Foundation, leading a workshop for airline employees about recognizing and addressing bias. Her past made her an unlikely messenger, but also a uniquely credible one. She didn't pretend to have all the answers, but she offered something perhaps more valuable, an honest accounting of how prejudice operates, how it justifies itself, and how it can be unlearned. The Morrison network continued to grow, expanding internationally, protecting children on trains, buses, and ships, as well as planes. Elijah remained involved, but increasingly stepped back from the public eye, focusing on being a student, a brother, a kid with dreams that extended beyond the incident that had made him famous. On the first anniversary of the plaque's installation at O'Hare, Elijah returned alone, his parents waiting nearby, but giving him space. He stood reading the words he'd helped craft, reflecting on how far they'd come and how far there was still to go. A young black girl, perhaps 7 or 8, approached the plaque, her mother beside her. They read it together, the child sounding out the longer words carefully. "Who's Elijah Morrison, Mama?" the girl asked. Before her mother could answer, Elijah spoke up. "He's just a kid who stood up for himself," he said with a smile, "and helped change things so other kids wouldn't have to." The girl studied him curiously. "Are you him? You look like the boy from the videos." Elijah nodded. "That's me. But the important part isn't what happened to me. It's what happened afterward. People working together to make things better." "Did it work?" she asked with a child's directness. "Is it better now?" Elijah considered the question carefully. "It's getting better," he said honestly. "And as long as kids like you keep asking questions like that, it will keep getting better." As the girl and her mother moved on, Elijah returned to his notebook, writing one final entry before rejoining his parents. "Today I met the future, a child who will grow up in a world slightly better than the one I faced at her age. Not perfect, not fixed, but better. And she'll make it better still." That's how progress works. Not in one dramatic moment, but in thousands of small choices to see each other's humanity and protect each other's dignity. One flight at a time. The notebook, once a tool of documentation and defense, had become something else. A chronicle of hope, a record of possibility, a testament to the simple truth that sometimes the smallest stand against injustice creates the biggest changes. A decade after Victoria's palm struck Elijah's cheek, aviation schools show the footage in training programs not as a lesson in customer service, but as a monument to moral courage. The torn fragments of Elijah's notebook remain one of the most visited exhibits at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, while the Morrison Network has expanded globally, protecting millions of vulnerable travelers. Elijah Morrison, now studying aerospace engineering, still carries a notebook wherever he goes, not out of fear, but habit. The slap that echoed through that first-class cabin continues to reverberate, answered by something more powerful. The collective voice of a society saying never again, and working to make those words reality. Victoria Blackwell's journey from perpetrator to educator proves that transformation is possible when we confront our darkest truths. Together, these intertwined lives demonstrate that dignity once claimed cannot be easily surrendered, and that sometimes a single moment of standing firm can change everything. If you found this story inspiring, please hit the like button below. Your support means the world to us and helps others discover this important message. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that challenge our perspectives and push for positive change. And don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Together we can create a world where every child is treated with dignity and respect. One flight at a time, one conversation at a time, we can make a difference.